There's nobody showing in attendees.
Let's see.
Maybe.
Attendees. I don't think it shows you the
Okay.
attendees until you start the meeting.
Yeah, it did because
Yeah.
Tammy is
Tammy, I don't see Jim though. Hi, everybody.
Hey, everyone.
I'm just trying to help Jim join the meeting. So I'm going to
Okay,
mute myself and then I'm going to call him really fast.
sounds great.
Chris, who's Kimberly Tida?
I believe she's with the Judicial Council.
Thank you.
Great. And I'm going to go ahead and promote Kim Wormsley. Would you mind promoting Kim Tida she's from the Judicial Council?
I'm trying to, but for some reason it's not working.
Oh, that's right. This down if you help. Hi, everybody. Happy lunchtime. Let's see. Let's see who we're waiting on. Hi, Bonachet. Hi, Christian. Amin has an ex parte hearing today that came up at the last minute, so Amin's not going to be able to join us. We're still waiting for Eric. Do we have Tammy? Oh, hi, Tammy. I had like the attendee box up on my screen, and it like perfectly covered your square.
Here.
So yeah, looking for Rich. Waiting for Rich. Kim Savage was probably not going to be able to come, and I see Christian. So it looks like we're waiting for Eric and Rich. Jim. So Eric is joining now. So we're almost at quorum. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Actually, we have quorum 5, but it would be nice to. We could start if you wanted, but I think Rich is going to be able to join. So.
Okay. So do you want to take roll?
Yeah, if you want to, if you'd like me to start with roll, we can do that right now. Hi, Donna.
Hello, I'm going to go off camera so I can eat lunch.
Great. You should definitely do that. When you eat lunch. I think it'd be okay for everyone to eat their lunch right now if you didn't have a chance to eat right before this meeting. Okay. Do we want to start with the housekeeping right before I do roll, Danielle?
Yes, thank you. I can do that. So welcome committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to today's meeting of the Homelessness Prevention Funds Committee. Thank you for joining us. We are using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to comment during the meeting, please use the raised hand feature. To use the raised hand feature by phone, dial *9 on your phone's dial pad. That will raise your hand, and you can also use the same command, again, *9 to lower your hand. Please utilize this tool to virtually indicate that you would like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. Going forward, all commission and committee meetings will be recorded and posted to the State Bar website. And a friendly reminder that this is a video conference and to please be aware of your surroundings behind you. A couple quick troubleshooting tips for those using Zoom on a computer. When on mute, holding down the space bar will temporarily unmute you. If you use your phone to dial into this meeting, please make sure your computer's microphone is on mute to avoid audio feedback issues. And while joining audio via computer is highly recommended, if you lose audio, you can call in separately using the Zoom conference number. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. And I'll take the roll call. Meeker.
Here.
Aflagi.
Here.
And then Al-Saraf let me know that he can't attend. Iskin.
Here.
Mahoney.
Here.
They are. Hi. And then Rhinus is supposed to be available, but maybe running a little bit late. Savage. already let me know that she might not be able to attend. And then Schreiber.
Yes, here.
Hi, Christian. All right, Jim, we do have quorum with exactly 5, which is the minimum we need. We might get 6. And then I'll take roll for the liaisons. Selena Copeland from LAC. I don't know if Selena, Kim, I don't know if, I haven't checked to see if anyone's in the attendees. Oh, Rich is in the attendees. Hi, Rich, we're gonna promote you to panelist right now. All right. Hi, Rich, and I've marked you as present for role. Sorry about the delay. I'm letting you in. And I didn't see Selena Copeland in the attendees. And then do we have Bonnie Huff from the Judicial Council? No, but I do see we have Kim Taida. Hi, Kim.
Hi, I think Bonnie and Melanie are supposed to be here at some point, but they might pop in a little bit later.
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And then for State Bar
Mel-
staff.
Melanie just joined.
Oh, hi, Melanie. Welcome.
Hello, sorry, I don't know what's happening with my calendar invite wanted me to start a meeting and it just kept wanting me to start this meeting and I knew it was already started. So
I'm glad you made it in. Welcome. Yeah, Melanie's with the Judicial Council. And then I'll take roll for staff. Dwan Wynn, let me know that she's in a meeting she couldn't get out of right now, but she's going to be coming in and out. So Dwan, do you happen to be here right now? I don't think so. Okay. So Dwan will be joining us a bit later. Chris McConkey is here. Danielle McRae.
Here.
Brady Dewar. Kim Wormsley.
Here, sorry,
Hi.
I was on mute.
All right. Okay, Jim, that concludes roll call.
Okay. So we have call for public comment.
Let's see. I don't see anyone in the attendees section, so no members of the public. Everyone who's here is like a panelist and a participant. Okay. If you want, though, we can keep an eye on it and see if anyone joins a bit later. And then if you want, we can go back and do a later public comment period if you want.
Yeah, well, perhaps after your presentation might be a good time for that. So the first thing on the agenda then is the approval of the homeless prevention. Oh no, sorry, approval of the meeting minutes of October 29th. So do I have a motion for that?
So moved.
I'll second.
Rich moved and Bonachet seconded. Thank you. And then I'll take the vote. Meeker?
Yes.
Bonachet?
Yes,
Sorry, I usually mean to call last name, so Aflagi.
it's all right.
Alsaroff is absent. Iskin?
Yes.
Mahoney?
Yes.
Rhinus?
Yes.
Savage, I think is still absent, and Schreiber.
Yes.
All right, thank you. So motion carries.
Okay. So now we have the approval of the grant, the competitive awards. And I think the order of this, you're going to have a presentation and then a brief summary on those that we're proposing to fund. And so those of you who've got specific questions on those specific grants, if you could raise those during the presentation on those grants, you'll at least it'll keep everything together. We won't have to be shuffling through all our notes and trying to find out where they are for that specific grant.
That's great. Yeah, and I'll share my screen. Danielle and Danielle are going to present together, but I'll share my screen right now. Okay, you should see in just a moment. So the report from the scoring team to the full committee, this presentation might take maybe like 20 minutes. We just want to be really thorough and sort of reporting back to you how the scoring team met and what it talked about. And then like Jim just said, we actually proposed to give a 30-second or so description of every, if helpful, every single one of the 23 recommended proposals. It could just serve to refresh your memory of if you looked at the profile sheets, but also it might jog a question. And then, like Jim suggested, we'll take maybe each of those 23 proposals in turn. So if you have a question about proposal number 20, you might have to wait a little bit, but that way we're not constantly jumping around and going back. That's the proposal anyway, is that we tackle it in that way. So that being said, you should, as always, stop and ask questions whenever they pop into your head at any time. So the agenda for the scoring team's presentation is we'll do a quick background for any members of the public or anyone who would like the refresher as to what were permissible activities, what the parameters of the statute were, what the committee voted to put into the RFP that's relevant for today's conversation. We'll describe the review process. We'll present to you the scores and funding recommendations. We'll note the public policy outcomes that we think the recommended projects would achieve, and then how they would advance the goals of Assembly Bill 164 or the State Budget Act. And then the discussion session is where we'll go through all 23 as helpful, and there's a resolution at the end. I anticipate we will not need nearly the amount of time that's available to us. We had set aside 4 hours for today, but I think it might be closer to a 2-hour meeting. And I'll give the heads up now. And we cleared this with Dwan and I cleared this with Jim in advance. We proposed to table discussion of the HP2 budget revision requests. Those grants are 3-year grants. In 2021, 2022, 2023. So it's the very first time any of those grantees would be seeking a budget revision to move money from year 1 to year 2. To table those for an ad hoc meeting in January, we weren't able to post the analyses early enough for you to be able to digest it. I think it became ready earlier this week, and we didn't want to ask you to vote on something you just saw. And it's not very time sensitive. And then we'll also probably combine a quick report on HP2 and HP3 reporting requirements in January as well. So those were agendas for today, but we're proposing to move those to January. Okay. I'll turn it over to Danielle.
Great. So first we wanted to briefly put in front of you again the timeline of the competitive grant process and where we are in it. And so the authorizing legislation for these funds was signed in July. And since that point, the goal has always been that the grant period for these funds would start on January 1. To do so, the committee approved the RFP and scoring rubric in late August, and staff released the applications very quickly thereafter. And then in an effort to encourage programs to incorporate partnerships, the State Bar staff, LAC, and Judicial Council had held a stakeholder gathering in late September before the applications were then due in October. Committee meeting, as you know, met to collaborate scores across a sample of 5 applications and met again to provide additional guidance to the scoring team before Thanksgiving. And then the goal of today is to finalize award recommendations for the full committee that they can then approve at their December 13th meeting. And again, as a reminder, the authorizing legislation for these funds was AB 164, which amends the Budget Act of 2021 and allocates $40 million to the Judicial Council to distribute through the commission, and an additional $40 million will become available in the following 2 years. So this allows us 3-year grant awards using the entire $80 million in funding, and it funds QLSPs and support centers to provide homelessness prevention services. We'll go over in the next slide in a moment the permissible activities. And after admin costs, 75% of that $40 million was directed to go to formula grants, and then 25% will go to the competitive grants, which we are speaking about today. And then again, the permissible activities outlined in AB 164 are on this slide. So they include eviction defense, other tenant defense assistance, and landlord-tenant rental disputes, services to prevent foreclosures for homeowners, which was a newer piece in this HP funding, And then pre-eviction, eviction legal services, as well as services to improve habitability, increase affordable housing, ensuring receipt of income benefits. And then again, a new piece this year was this language around helping folks displaced because of domestic violence, and then a catch-all homelessness prevention piece was included in that legislation as well. And then again, just a reminder, the Budget Act for the competitive awards specifically, they must be a QLSP or support center, although the legislature has encouraged those organizations to partner or subgrant with other programs that do not need to be a QLSP or support center. So those could be community-based organizations or government organizations. They must be performing the permissible activities we just talked about on the prior slide. They must not use the funds to supplant existing funds. And there was particular mention that projects serving rural or underserved communities must receive preference. And so, as you all know, in August, you approved the rubric and RFP that was used by the scoring committee to evaluate these proposals. The RFP provided guidance for each criterion. The staff proposed definitions for each criterion being not addressed, below expectations, meets expectations, or exceeds expectations. And the rubric is a tool for the staff and the committee to use while we're scoring these applications, but scores do not guarantee funding, which allows the scoring team and the committee to exercise discretion in making awards that accomplish the goals of the legislation, which may include distributing the grants statewide and striving for a diversity of interventions to address homelessness prevention. And then finally, we wanted to put the rubric in front of you again to remind you of the different categories that we were evaluating as we looked at each grant proposal. So those were project impact and strategies, organizational capacity, focus on rural populations, focus on underserved populations, project evaluation, and special consideration. And again, most of those are exceeds, meets, below expectations, or not addressed. Special considerations instead was on a scale of 1 to 10 points. So I will turn it back over to Chris.
Thank you, Danielle. So we wanted to make sure we laid that foundation, refresh everyone's memories. And now we're gonna kind of start the report back part. The committee received 34 applications for HP3 competitive grant funding. Altogether, the applicants were seeking about $33,800,000 combined. There were 29 qualified legal services projects that applied and 5 support centers. 34 of the applicants, which is all of them, would focus on underserved communities. Now that was, Danielle pointed out that AB 164 required the committee to confer preference in some way on those that would focus on underserved or rural. So they all are, there was an actual question on the application that said, how will you serve particularly underserved communities? Here's what that means, explain. And they all answered that question in the affirmative. 26 answered in the affirmative that they would focus on rural communities, and they provided an explanation. Given the short timeline for review, the commission, because the statute said we needed to administer the funds rather quickly, the commission delegated authority to staff to score in consultation with the committee, and the committee identified its consultative role as happening in at least 3 moments. So one was before scoring. The whole committee calibrated the rubric to a cross-section of like a representative sampling of proposals, and the scoring team observed that process. And committed to using the results of that calibration session in scoring. During scoring, the committee had its chair, Jim, participate in all sessions, scoring sessions and conversations. And that includes conversations about funding recommendations. And then after scoring, which is today's meeting, to be able to ask the scoring team about their recommendations and adjust them as necessary. So that's why we set aside so much time for today, so that you feel comfortable voting on the recommendations at the end of this meeting. So the scores are in the memo. So you've seen this table before. The 4-person scoring team, which was Dwan Nguyen, 3 members of the Office of Access and Inclusion, a program manager, an acting program supervisor, and a senior program analyst. It was Dwan, Danielle, and myself, plus the committee chair, arrived at consensus scores for every single application, and not just the total score, but we arrived at a consensus score for every row of the rubric, including special considerations. So we actually read them individually and then came together in a series of meetings. I think we might have met 4 or 5 times for 1 to 2 hours at a time, and actually said, okay, Inner City Law Center, what are they going to get for impact and strategies? What are they going to get for org capacity? And had to negotiate with one another to a consensus score. So it was actually quite a bit of interaction between the scoring team members. We didn't like average them or something. The highest score out of 100 possible points was 88, and that was Inner City Law Center score. The attachment C, I think, actually breaks down every score, including for those that weren't recommended for funding, all the way down to you can see like in the rubric what they got and how their total score is composed. The lowest score was 54. The average was 71. The most common score was 75. And the scoring team recommends funding the 23 highest scoring proposals, which are in this table, and those have a 20-point spread from 68 to 88 points. And then we're going to offer to talk to you about each of these 23 proposals. So kind of like split them amongst us so we can give you like a 30-second summary of each one, and then you can ask questions. But before we launch that piece, to kind of let you know how we arrived at funding recommendations, there was $19,500,000 available for HP3 competitive awards. So splitting that among the 23 applicants looked a little like this. The scoring team, this is a non-comprehensive list, but this kind of captures the thrust of the conversation. The scoring team started with the highest scoring proposal and basically worked its way down until the money was gone. So it started with Inner City Law Center until the funds were exhausted. And it looked at the proportionality of the project deliverables, the number of clients, the number of cases, how much interaction it was going to have with partners, and tried to get a sense of like, was the funding request like sized correctly for what they were proposing to do? That was sort of like the first thing we talked about. And then the next thing was how fiscally conservative was the budget proposal to begin with. So there's a couple on the next slide. I think I have a chart that actually shows what they asked for, what we're recommending, and what the difference is. So you'll see for a couple of them, it's extremely close. They basically were recommending their full request because their budget was so conservative, we literally could not think of anything they could take out. If anything, we thought they kind of under budgeted a bit. So those ones we just said, well, let's give, and it was a smaller ask than some of the other proposals. So that would be the explanation for those ones. We talked about their capacity to implement an impactful project if we didn't recommend the full ask. Like if they found out that their award was going to be a little lower than what they requested, would this project still be an impactful homeless prevention project, even if they had to reduce their deliverables slightly? We looked at the sufficiency of the budget narratives and explanations, how detailed the budget narratives were. And we didn't put a ton of weight on this, but we did allow ourselves to take into account whether or not they were going to be receiving an HP3 formula award. And if so, how much? There were 75 applicants for HP3 formula funding, as you may remember, and they all were approved. So there's a very small number of projects that actually applied for only the competitive grant and not the formula. And there's a lot that applied for both. And since the formula grants follow a statutory formula, the amount is set. Some of them stand to receive millions of dollars of formula funding. And some of them are going to be receiving $0 because they didn't apply for a formula grant. So we took that into account in deciding how much to cut from their budget request. On average, the whole group together, it's about 80% of the group as a whole is getting about 80% of their budget request. And the Office of Access and Inclusion did ask all 23 of them whether their deliverables might have to change if they got less than what they requested. And we kind of floated the idea that like if you were in this range for an award, and the range was what we ended up recommending, We just didn't make any commitment to them that they were going to get a grant or that it would be that amount if they did. So we do have some updates for you when we go through each of them as to like, you know, this program said they wouldn't have to change their deliverables at all. This one said they might change it in this way.
Hey, Chris, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So great presentation so far. One of the general observations that I had, and maybe you'll address this in terms of evaluating the appropriateness of the budget, was that with respect to the subgrants, at least maybe I read them too quickly, but my observation was that there was typically not a lot of detail about how the subgrant money was going to be spent. And I particularly had that observation about the Inner City Law Center proposal, where there was substantial subgrants. I didn't see much detail at all about what the subgrantees were going to do. So I'm putting that out as a placeholder observation, and I'm wondering if you can address that kind of generally as you go through.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good thing to address right now. And then we can talk about it again when Center City is going to be the first one we probably talk about. Speaking for myself, I would agree that in reviewing, so I don't know if Jim, Dwan, or Danielle feel differently, but I would agree that the applications were very detailed in what the primary applicant, the Keyless Peer Support Center, was proposing to do, all the way down to quantifiable like deliverables. And then there was great range and level of detail for the partners. So I would diagnose it as in specific lines of questioning in the application, there is a table where they're supposed to itemize what both the Keyless Peer Support Center and the partners would be doing each quarter. And what I observed was most of the applicants just described what they were going to be doing and not what their partner would do. And they used the narrative question on the application, what will your partner do? They were supposed to just describe kind of at a high level what the story was. They used that to describe the partner's role, and it led to an information imbalance, in my opinion. So that would need to be, that's an area for improvement, I think, in future iterations of the application. I think as a scoring team that was looking at the budgets, we did take note of the ones that had particularly large subgrants, and if we had a good sense of what the partner would be doing. And we did sort of take that into account in deciding how much to cut from their award. So I can't quite remember if this is actually a project where we did that. But so for instance, for like housing and economic rights advocates, where we recommended 1,100,000 instead of the full 1,500,000, our thinking was that their partners would, and this particular applicant would probably choose to give their partners less money and to help share the shortfall of $400,000 rather than take that on themselves, HERA, and their partners would get the same amount. But we would let them decide what to do with that shortfall between what they asked for and what they got. I don't know if Danielle or Jim what would you correct?
I just wanted to add, remember, Eric, that the inclusion of non-state funded partners was kind of a late part of this grant process, involved us delaying things a bit in order to have a webinar for the different people that were applying to talk about this issue of using non-state funded, state bar funded partners. And so given that it was late added, and that was something that these organizations weren't typically going to do in other kind of proposals from this from us, that's one of 3 changes that the scoring group is going to propose to the committee here that we adopt in the future. That is, that more details be given on how these non-state bar funded partners are going to actually use the money. And there's also a suggestion that this could be closely monitored for any proposed budget modifications, that we ask for more specific elaborations on exactly how these partners are going to be spending their money.
Yeah, Danielle, I don't know if you have anything to add about level of detail and subgrants.
I have something to add. Yeah, I
Hi,
think,
Dwan.
sorry, I'm in and out of today's meeting because I have a competing training. But Eric, I do share your observation that some of them lacked in detail. I will say though that some of the though it wasn't explicit, some of their sub-grants, there seemed like to be a natural connection, and maybe they didn't outright say it, but for me, it was a bit more obvious. Like there are some organizations that to me, it was obvious that they had a community partner based in, a harder to reach area because of outreach. So they might not have gone through the steps of X, Y, and Z, and this is why we're partnering this, but by the sheer nature of what that organization, that sub-grantee does, I drew that connection. And so for a lot of them, that was sufficient for me. But I do think I agree with Chris's point. There is wide variation, and maybe in our design in the future, if we want more details, we have more directed questions or give some TA so that programs know, because I do think this is similar in terms of the level of detail that we received in other discretionary grants for sub-grantees. So maybe that's something that we need to work on to communicate better with applicants.
Duan, this is Rich. Eric raises a good point, but if I understand what you just said correctly, we are asking our grantee to commit for the sub-grantee as to how the sub-grantee will use the funds. Should we require the sub-grantee to sign off on that in the application?
Well, we require the lead applicant to be responsible for their sub-grantee, including deliverables and oversight. And so I don't think it's necessary to say have the sub-grantee verify that. The onus is on the lead grantee, and that's been communicated to our programs very clearly. And it's in the grant agreement. And that's just an expectation that we've always had. So for instance, there are heavy reporting requirements for this. And so it would be the responsibility of the lead grantee to collect the deliverables from the sub-grantee reported to us. It just wouldn't be efficient for us to then work directly with the sub-grantee.
If I could just say one more thing, in most cases, the sub-grantee amounts were not that substantial, so it wasn't a significant issue for me. But for Inner City Law Center, it kind of was significant. I mean, out of the 1.5 million, I think something like $600,000, if I remember this right, was sub-grants. And again, this is a good project, although I wasn't as excited about it as the rest of you, but it's a good project, but it's a computer program that's going to be distributed statewide to help in eviction unlawful detainer cases. I just didn't understand what the 600,000 was going to be used for. And if you do, I'm not going to object to it. I just think that requires a bit more explanation. We're recommending to give them $1.4 million out of the $1.5 million that they're asking for.
Well,
So,
keep in mind, Eric, there were two sub-grantees on that proposal. One was the Leadership Council for Justice and Accounting, and that is a state bar funded program. So those
no,
are
Leadership Council is not. Leadership Council, they did apply for funding a few years ago. We're not found eligible, but they do services in predominantly systems work, impact work in rural parts of California. So they're a very reputable organization that will be helping, again, with outreach, with the impact work. But they're state bar funded.
Yeah, and it was only 300,000 to the debt collection partner who's not a typical legal services provider.
So one of the and actually this is going to be a really good segue, because we were going to propose to go through all 23 of them in order of score. So Inner City Law Center would have been first. The sort of like policy question the scoring team has for the committee is, do these funding figures look right to the extent that you know with the information that the scoring team is reporting back to you and the summaries you've had. So there is the opportunity in this meeting and the invitation actually, that if the committee actually wants to take like a little bit away from Inner City Law Center and give it to EDC or San Luis Obispo Legal Assistance Foundation, which are at the very bottom of the table, and they're getting a lot less than what they asked for, like that would be a welcome role for the committee to play in today's meeting, is to tweak those funding figures. Just wanted to flag that. Since Inner City Law Center is actually going to be the first one we talk about, should I think I just have like maybe 1 or 2 more slides, and then it's going to be we'll go through all 23, and we actually are going to start with ICLC.
This is Bonnie. I just had one other thing, and I apologize, I'm not remembering from the grant agreement, but I think we'll also want to make it really clear to the main agency that who they subgrant to is also going to be subject to single audit and the other requirements of the federal funding, because that it's getting really attenuated, but making sure that they can comply as well. So because the burden will be on the legal services agency to make sure that they comply, but again, it's all federal money. So.
And we did have a training with our auditors about the single audit requirement to programs. And that question did come up about the subgrantees. And so it came up in a couple different versions. So I know that programs are starting to think about, but I think, the repeated probably messaging will help.
Yeah, because I just don't know that a lot of agents, like, oh, okay, you're writing the grant and not thinking about all the things that are potentially impacted by that. So that's all.
So just for the last thing about this slide is, before I kind of dive into the details, is the top 23 scoring proposals saw together $25,209,978, and there's again only $19,500,000 available. So the scoring team had to figure out where to cut $5,709,000-ish. And one thing we actually looked at was cutting it off at 70 points, and so that EDC and Sloloff would have dropped off the bottom of the table, and making the cuts a little less deep, except for two things. One was we thought that those projects were worth funding first and foremost, and two, we actually thought that the 21 top scoring projects, those that scored 70 or above, could do really, really impactful work with this amount of money, and giving them a little bit more wasn't necessarily going to be like, it was better to squeeze out 2 more really great projects than to just get closer to the top 21 scoring proposals as budget requests. So that's why we cut it off we proposed to cut it off at 68. But I just wanted you to know that we actually talked about that quite a bit in our scoring team meetings.
And I just want to also add about the Eviction Defense Collaborative Project in San Luis Obispo. We did think that they were quality projects, and also the service area. If you'll see from the map that Chris and Danielle created, I think EDC is the only program that's in San Francisco that we would be funding. And then San Luis Obispo obviously is a rural area. So we took that into consideration, not just the quality, but the service area.
One thing that wasn't really on the list in the memo of things we talked extensively about in arriving at a funding recommendation was score. Like, we actually thought we probably were going to maybe like prefer those that had the highest score, maybe give them a little bit more of their requests, but we ended up not really doing that, as you can see from this table. It ended up having more to do just with like how conservative their budget was. Is it tied to the size of the work they're going to do? And then the two things I'll kind of point out is Legal Aid of Sonoma County is getting almost their entire ask, short of $7,000, and Legal Aid of Marin, and those two budgets were very, very conservative. I think they're also kind of smaller budgets, like Legal Aid of Marin is on the smaller side anyway, but we looked at that and we actually thought that, they probably could have asked for a bit more than they did. So we didn't see a reason to cut deeper. Okay, I think maybe just I'll turn it back over to Danielle for like 2 more slides, and then it's the discussion piece.
Yeah, and these will be pretty quick. Before we go into each proposal individually, we wanted to just say at the outset, overall, the recommended projects articulate a clear nexus to homelessness prevention, propose a strong impact on homelessness in California, as indicated by their impact scores. Again, a heavy focus on rural communities. 19 of the proposals indicated a focus on rural communities, and also a focus on underserved communities. That was the case in all applications. Together, the recommended projects would serve every county, particularly because there are 5 programs that are statewide, but with a particular focus on 24 counties specifically, which are in the map in attachment E. And then also the recommended projects balance QLSPs and support center services. So there's 19 QLSPs and 4 support centers that we are recommending funding. Nearly all of the recommended projects scored exceeds expectations in at least one category. Most of them scored in several categories. And then most of them scored at least 5 points in the special consideration category as well. And then just to remind you, as we're going through the proposals, the different attachments that you have available to you, attachment A is the RFP that programs received with the application as they were filling it out. Attachment B is a spreadsheet of scores and our funding recommendations, as well as some characteristics of the proposals. Attachment C is a breakdown of each proposal score, so you can see the individual component scores of each row of the rubric. Attachment D are some profile sheets, which summarize at a high level each project and proposal. And then attachment E is a map of the recommended projects. And again, there are 5 that will serve statewide, but then that map is focusing on ones that identified specific counties to serve.
So Danielle, Dwan, and Jim and I checked in before this meeting to strategize what we thought would be the most efficient but effective way to tee the full committee up for an informed, comfortable vote, where at the end of this meeting you felt like comfortable either adopting the scoring team's recommendations or adjusting them and then adopting. So what we propose, but we actually, this is a good feedback moment if you want to do something slightly different or even more efficient. What we proposed was actually to go through all 23 in order of score. So not to talk about the ones that we're not recommending for funding unless you want to ask about any one of those in particular, but starting with inner city and working our way down to Sloloff, and give you like a 30-second, like it's a QLSP or it's a sports center. These are the counties they'd serve. This was what they said about rural and underserved. And this is the general nature of their intervention. Like this is the homelessness prevention type work they'll do. And if you don't have any questions, we can just move right on to the next one. But if you do, we'll stop and we can pull up our notes, and actually the scoring team can talk to you about the score we gave or the funding recommendation. So that's what we propose, but we want this to be as helpful and efficient as possible for all of you. So if anybody wants to take a different approach, just let us know. Tammy.
Yeah, and you may have mentioned, so my apologies, but within that description, your 30-minute or 30-second description, will you talk about their budget? Because some of these have really large differences, and I'd be interested in hearing the staff's view on why we feel comfortable with the lower amount.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. We'll try and do that too. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll actually tab back to sorry, skip. I think so. This is the next slide was the proposed resolution, but I had stuck the table again at the end that has the score, their request, and their recommendation, because I can actually edit this table as we go along, especially if the committee wants to move money around. So I'm going to leave this table up, and then if we do need to make a change, I'll just make it in the table, and that's what this is what you will see when you vote at the end of the meeting. So I'm going to turn it over to Danielle, who's going to present the first half of the batch, and then I'll present the second half.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so first we'll start with Inner City Law Center, which we've chatted about so far a bit, but they are QLSP. Their project, because it is that web-based tool, will serve all counties as a statewide project. They had the highest score at a total of 88. And again, the intervention is a statewide web-based eviction defense tool that folks can use on the web, and they aim to reach 2,500 clients through folks through that tool. But then also they plan to provide full scope representation to clients in LA particularly. And so for their focus on rural, they indicated that one of their partners is focused particularly on doing outreach and providing services in rural portions of the state. And then for underserved, their organization is located in Skid Row, and they also identified a desire to serve undocumented clients, precariously housed clients, and then Black, Indigenous, people of color as well. And so they received a meets for both rural and underserved. They received a meets expectations in those categories. And then again, looking at their funding recommendation compared to their total requests, they requested 1.5 million. We proposed 1.4. And Chris is right in that in most instances, we did not fund programs closer to their request simply because they had a higher score. But I think this may have been the one exception because they were the highest scoring program. And in looking at their budget, we didn't see anything, or I didn't see anything that was unreasonable. We funded them pretty close to that overall ask. And then they were one of the programs that when we asked if you were funded at this level, again, no promises made, how, if at all, would that affect your deliverables? And they indicated that it would not affect their deliverables to be funded at 1.4 million. So I will stop there if there are any questions. It looks like Bonafshay has a question.
I do. I'm somewhat in agreement with Eric. Given the amount that we have to dispense with this year, and the numbers that we're looking at in terms of 5 million something, 5 million two, I think Chris said that we're not would have to cut. This seems to me a little generous, but at the same time, obviously we don't want to cut so much where they're not able to do the work that they say they're out to do. And this is one of those applicants that I was very excited about, particularly the kind of work that they're doing. It's very innovative. But just looking at that amount seems a little excessive. But I want to be mindful because you guys have done the deeper dive than we have done. So can you tell us a little bit more about why you thought 1.4 is recommended here? Whereas, for example, with just 2 points shy of their score, we look at California Rural Legal Assistance. They too asked for 1.5 and received 1.2. 5 points lower, a bit more. Inland County also asked for 1.5, and we said 1.3. So if you could just kind of walk us through that thinking, please.
I can help with that, Danielle and Chris. So Inner City Law Center is a pretty large organization in Southern California. We believe they have the organizational capacity to kind of absorb such a big increase in funding. And we also wanted to pretty much closely fund their total request because of the strong partnerships that they have. And I don't know if you'll recall, during the gathering that we held to kind of encourage partnerships, Inner City Law Center, they were a partner organization to kind of support that 1487 legislation that didn't pass. So we do think that it's not just because they were featured in our gathering, but this is a model kind of model project in terms of the types of projects that the legislature wants to fund. And I think that was substantiated by what they described in that project. And it has the numbers that they report in their deliverables. It's very, very strong compared to the other projects. But I think one of the main reasons is because they are such a solid organization that we believe that they could absorb the 1.4. With that said, though, Bonachay and Eric, if and other committee members, if you thought that there was a program that could use a little bit more of a haircut, this might be the one, because when we went back to them with the 1.4, as Danielle said, they said that they could absorb that cut. They have other funding to pull in. So if this is an area, if there is a place to cut, and to move down some funding to maybe EDC or San Luis Obispo, this room could probably afford maybe a 50,000 or 100,000, but I wouldn't recommend doing much more than that because it scored the highest and because of the far reach of the project proposal.
Yeah, because I would recommend that we consider shaving, obviously leaving it open to the rest of the colleagues here, but I would recommend shaving some off of here. And supporting some of the other grant amounts.
The other committee members want to weigh in. I think the scoring team like Duan just said, would agree with that, or stands by its recommendation, but is also comfortable with that. If I would say for a process, if I don't hear any objections, I will interpret that as support.
And is it in support, Banisha, you can elaborate, would that 50,000 or 100,000 feel comfortable?
I would say 100,000 would feel comfortable.
Feel comfortable, okay.
Yeah.
And would you like us now to just maybe put that aside, and then we could see where we want to, as we go down, add that in? But the two
sounds
bottom,
like a good, yeah, that sounds like a good process.
Okay.
I stopped sharing my screen just because I have to exit slideshow in order to edit the table. So it's going to look a little smaller now. Hopefully, is it still big enough that you can read
I think
it?
that's fine, Chris.
I'm going to change it to 1,300,000, and I'm putting in my notes right now that we have 100,000 to reallocate. And I'm just going to keep it like a tally. Danielle, if you wouldn't mind like also doing that just to check me. And at the very end, before we vote, staff is probably going to go into Excel and add it all up and make sure that we've still like, you know, it still adds up to 19,500,000, and then we'll take like a 5-minute break before voting.
But before we move off of this discussion, I just want to check in with the rest of the folks also on the call and see, you know, my other colleagues, how do you guys feel about that? Do you think 100,000 is the right number? Should it be less? Should it be more?
I'm comfortable with that number.
Yeah, I am as well.
Great. And we can go back if we have to, right? That's okay too. Somebody changes their mind or something. Okay, Danielle, back to you.
Great. So the next project is California Indian Legal Services. This is also a QLSP. They propose to serve Alpine, Inyo, and Mono counties. And feel free to correct my pronunciation on counties. I'm relatively new to California, so I will get some of them wrong. This program proposes to expand housing legal services, including eviction defense, into Eastern Sierra part of the state via remote workstations, and partner with urban Indian health organizations to offer resources and representation also in more urban parts of those counties. Their emphasis on rural, again, is through those 8 remote workstations, which we felt was strong enough to merit and exceeds expectations since they're going out into those remote communities. And then for underserved populations, they also received and exceeds expectations. And they talked about serving Native American clients, elderly, disabled folks that are non-English speakers as well. As you can see, their total request was about 971,000. We proposed to fund the project at 700,000. And that was partially because they provided less detail on their deliverables in terms of quantifying their deliverables. We thought the interventions and the project that they explained was strong, but they did not provide as much detail on how many clients they intend to serve. And so we were slightly less impressed with that component, which is why they got maybe a little more shaved off than potentially expected given their score. And then when we asked how this would change their deliverables, they said they would reduce their deliverables by about 15% of their original plan. But again, I don't believe they quantified the numbers up front, so I don't have a number for how much that 15% is in number of clients.
Correct me if this is wrong, Duan, but is that the normal thing for grantees do if they learn that their award will be like 10% less? They like.
Yeah, that's one way that they've done it, but grantees. But I have to say for this particular organization and their project proposal, they did talk at length about how much more expensive service delivery is in rural parts, having to drive certain X distance from one office to another. So I think because of that too, it's also difficult for them to quantify versus an urban program that's used to having a really steady caseload. It's just a little bit less predictable in rural service areas. And so I believe that that's part of one of their challenges in quantifying that. But because we obviously want to be able to serve as much money and go the furthest we can with these dollars, that's why we gave them more of a haircut than Inner City Law Center. The other thing is this organization is a great organization, but it has had some organizational and infrastructure challenges over the years. So we thought not at the full 971,000, which is close to $1 million, but a 700,000 would be a bit more appropriate.
Can I ask a question? So they're planning to serve, provide full scale representation of those 3 counties through the 3 years, which may well be right given the size of those counties, and then providing assistance to another.
Yes, so they're proposing to provide services in the rural counties through those remote workstations. So going out and meeting with clients, but then also they talked about partnering with urban Indian health organizations to provide resources and I believe some representation in those settings as well.
So, but we don't know which they would be cutting back. Sorry, I should have.
Oh, gotcha. No, I don't believe. I can double check a little bit later, but I don't believe they indicated kind of which of those services would be cut.
Danielle, was it your thought that the urban element of this would truly attack the HP problem more so than the rural aspect of their proposal?
No, I don't think that that's the case. I think both are expecting to provide, in both settings, they're expecting or proposing to provide housing legal services. So I think in both cases, the kind of level of service and the connection to homelessness is still very apparent. Homelessness prevention, rather.
Right. Okay. I'm good with this.
Okay.
I have a quick question. So this is I'm happy to see that we've scored this work up at 86, and I want to apologize. Where I'm at right now, they're going to start using machines to cut grass, and it's going to get a little loud. But my question is, when you went back to ask about specifically who they're going to be serving, what percentage they're going to be serving, you said in that additional questioning, they still weren't allowed, they weren't able to give you a full response?
So I don't want to make it sound as if they did not answer the questions asked to them. But in their original proposal, they quantified their deliverables less than other programs did. I think in part because of what Dwan mentioned about it just being a little less predictable in a remote or in a rural setting. But then what happened is we asked all the programs that were not going to receive their full ask based on the recommendations and kind of ranges that we had in mind coming into today. We said, how would this change your deliverables? And they said it would decrease our deliverables by about 15%. And so they answered the question that we asked, but because we didn't have a firm sense of what those starting numbers are, we still don't have a firm sense of what the new numbers would be.
And that's great, because that's where my question is going, because I'm wondering just that their response is an accurate response given the communities that they're serving, that they really don't have those numbers. It's much more challenging to get to those numbers than, for example, one of our other grantees. So I want to make sure that we don't hold that against them, because this is a 270,000 for an organization like this is pretty significant. And doing the kind of work they're doing and where they're doing it and for whom they're doing it is pretty significant. So I want to make sure that we underscore that it's not so much that they don't want to tell us, or they don't have the capability internally because there's something about the organization that can't get to those numbers, but it's literally the communities they serve, where they serve, the rural nature of where they serve that has them not be able to give us those numbers. So thank you. I just wanted to clarify that.
And I just want to add, and we usually do this as a courtesy to programs. We started doing this about 5 years ago with discretionary grants, going back to give them a preliminary number, so that you all have a sense if there's a cut, what the cut in the deliverables would be too, and we can have a little bit of back and forth. But with that said, it's not formal. We don't open up the application for them and have them go back and revise the outcomes, because we don't know what the final number is going to be. So it's a very kind of informal email to them. They informally send back us a couple of sentences, a paragraph sometimes. And so, yeah, we shouldn't hold them or penalize them because they were not told that this would be, it's really just to get a sense for you all.
And if I could just follow up, do they have access to other funding, or is for this purposes, or is our funding really their sole funding for this purposes?
I can't speak to their funding outside of state bar funding, but they are planning, or they will receive $512,097 in the formula allocation as well, which they are expecting to, or planning to use for a very similar set of services. I think this is really kind of an expansion of what they proposed in their formula budget.
And they are a legal services corporation, basic field grantee. So they are, I think, maybe are one of the smaller grantees from federal LSC, but they get pretty reliable federal funding every year.
Thank you for answering all these questions. This community is, to me, is usually beyond underserved. So I'm happy to see that they've made it at the level that we have them, and trying to give them as much support as possible. So thank you guys for answering the questions.
Of course. Okay, does the group feel comfortable moving to the next project? Okay, I will go ahead and do that. The next project is California Rural Legal Assistance, or CRLA. They are also a QLSP. The counties they listed as planning to serve are Monterey, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, and Ventura counties. They are scored an 86. And then their intervention is providing wraparound legal services and holistic homelessness prevention and full scope eviction defense in the Central Coast. So they are planning to do traditional eviction defense UD work, and also some additional legal services that can impact income stability and therefore housing stability. And one of the things they mentioned in particular was doing a record clearing clinic for folks with a criminal record. And they are partnering with housing and economic rights advocates, which is a little lower on our list, but those projects pair together. They received exceeds expectations in serving rural communities because of this focus on the Central Coast. They also included that they will be serving, they have, field offices in each of those counties. So they have, brick and mortar offices to serve folks in person. For underserved communities, they also received an exceeds. They described serving Black, Indigenous, and people of color, folks with disabilities, LGBTQ+ clients, as well, again, as formerly incarcerated clients through that record clearing clinic, which is really unique and not something that we saw in, I don't believe, any of the other projects proposed. They asked for the full $1.5 million. We proposed 1.2 million. And part of that is because they are receiving a very high formula allocation. They are getting over $4.5 million through the HP3 formula. And when we reached out to ask how their deliverables might change if they were funded at the $1.2 million level, they indicated that it would not affect their deliverables, they would cut those costs elsewhere, whether it be administration or non-personnel costs.
I feel like I need to say something about this amount as well. I mean, we're coming on to Christmas. I don't want to be the Scrooge, but I also want to be mindful of what you just said, which is they're receiving another 4.5 million. Again, asking the rest of the folks that are on this call, similar to Inner City Law Center, if they would be comfortable with a cut here as well.
This one for CRLA. We're on CRLA.
This is for California Rural Legal, assistance.
So could you say again, Danielle, what the counties they were going to serve? They're one of our more like rural.
Yes.
And they identified like multiple rural counties. There's others identified like just one. So.
Yes, so it's Central Coast area, and so it's Monterey, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, and Ventura. And so I think several of those are kind of a rural urban mix based on the work of the Access Commission.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to the budget discussion for this is because they are a program that can probably afford a bigger haircut, also being an LSC basic field grantee, I think we were, for them, we were like, oh, it's a lot of money going to rural California if we channel it through them. I think that was our thinking.
Do any of my colleagues feel that Tammy, I just see her hand go up.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to just chime in. No, I agree that we should consider just decreasing it a bit, largely because they have the additional funding. So I can support that.
This program has a 20% cut. The California Indian Legal Services is a 30% cut. Is there a way to compare those and to rationalize why one is a 30% cut and the other is a 20%?
That's a good question. I think part of the reason that California Indian Legal Services received a little bit more of a cut was, again, because those deliverables were less clearly quantified. But since through the discussion today, it sounds like the committee is actually potentially okay with that, given the nature of their work and where the clients they plan to serve are located. So I don't have a great answer for why they received different cuts, given that new kind of consideration.
You know, and in light of Rich's question, because I've been doing the same kind of accounting, I would recommend that we take some of the funds that we're looking at in pulling from Inner City and potentially now here, California Rural Legal, and give California Indian Legal Services a bump from that 700,000.
I think we ought to wait on that. There are so many here that are, all of them are cut pretty much, except for a few. Let's wait and see where to apply that 100 and to what degree. I would rather have
I agree with you. No, I agree with you to wait and the how much, but I would like to put their name, if we can start a column of those that we would think to add to. But in terms of California Rural Legal Assistance, I'd like to propose a similar cut of 100,000. And I'm open to what the rest of the folks here think as well.
Ignore the wonkiness that's happening. I'm adding a column and I'll reformat this.
Okay,
on the
great.
slide
Thank
again.
you.
Just give me a moment.
The reason I asked the question about rural versus urban was because I wonder if the data supports the notion that homelessness is a serious problem in the rural counties for the Indian population as it is for non-Indian populations, given the fact that they're on federal land. That's my only thought there.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point.
I don't think we have any data on that I'm aware of.
Really not federal land, is it? It's their land.
It's their land. Yeah.
This is very helpful, Chris.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you.
Oh yeah, of course. My pleasure.
And remember, the population of Alpine is 1,700 people for the state. I mean, we're the California Indian legal, the places they're focusing on have fairly small populations.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Bonnie.
There are 6 divorces a year.
6 divorces?
A year in the
Wow.
county, just to get a sense of
What's
legal.
happening? Yeah. Good to know.
Small
Thank-
counties, yeah.
So just make sure, Bonishay, it was possibly come back and cut a little bit more from CRLA, right?
No, I was actually making the suggestion of 100,000 cut now, but again, opening to the discussion so that, maybe Bonnie has something to share with us here that can help. And then of course, the rest of my colleagues on the committee to weigh in on what they think.
Okay.
I just started the discussion.
Great. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure you weren't saying like we should increase their award, but
No, it was lower. Yeah.
okay. Thank you.
Well, would the committee like to speak further about CRLA, or would you all prefer I move on to the next project and we kind of come back
Move on.
having flagged that as a project that we could potentially lower?
Let's move on.
Okay. So the next project is from Inland Counties Legal Services, which is also a QLSP. They are proposing to serve Riverside and San Bernardino counties, and they scored an 83 on the rubric. And then their intervention is legal services to chronically homeless and actually homeless individuals, connecting them with benefits and housing, and partnering their partners would provide some social services and kind of wraparound services in addition to the legal services that the organization itself would be providing. For rural impact on rural counties, we gave them an exceeds expectations because they talked about outreach via mobile access center. And so again, they would be going out to the rural communities in person. And then the underserved category, they received a meets expectations. This focus on benefits particularly helps families with children and veterans, which was a little more novel. And then they also asked for the full 1.5 million, or the maximum of 1.5 million. We recommended 1.3 million because looking at their budget, they had some higher non-personnel costs. I think we were comfortable with the having a relatively large budget in relation to the number of clients that they were serving, but their non-personnel costs were particularly high compared to other programs, which is why we shaved a little bit off. And then when we asked them if they would need to change their deliverables, if they were to receive 1.3 million, they indicated that the deliverables would not change. They would lower those non-personnel costs or administrative costs instead of programmatic costs. Yeah, it looks like Tammy has a question or comment.
Yeah, Danielle, so when you did reach out to these organizations, I think Chris earlier said you spoke of a range up to this recommended amount. So when they say that deliverables won't change or won't have significant impact on those deliverables, I assume there's, again, a little bit of cushion to go down with comfort.
And just to clarify, because I was probably too vague before, we didn't actually give them a range in writing. We were like somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 or anything, but we just worded it to be like, we're in the ballpark of, so for ICLS, we would have said, we're in the ballpark of like 1,300,000. Could you make that work? We kind of made it sound like there was, but I didn't give them like they weren't responding to a very defined range. I didn't mean to like wreck your train of thought, Danielle. I was really
No, that,
about
I
to
mean, that was,
respond.
we covered, no, I think that's right, that they were not given a formal range. We said 1.3 million, but with the clear caveat that this was just gauging how that might affect their deliverables if that were to be the figure or something around that dollar amount. And they indicated it would not.
And I would just like to add too, that I would argue not to cut them more because of the very large geographical area that they've got to cover, especially in the high desert up around Victorville. I mean, compared to the other rural projects, they've got a lot of landmass to cover.
Yeah, I agree, Jim, which is why I've been quiet on this one. Yeah, it's a large area.
I don't want to like play favorites or anything, but I would say the scoring team kind of like this one. I feel like memory serves me was like the darling. It didn't get the highest score, but like it was one of the only projects we read where they proposed to serve more or less exclusively those who were already homeless. And whereas other projects was kind of a mix of those who are homeless and at risk, or maybe just current tenants who would become homeless. And we know that it's so challenging to reach and be able to work with and then stay in touch with people who are already homeless, that we were very impressed. And they designed their intervention, like they clearly thought through what it means to try and find and then stay in touch with and effectively help sensitively that community. Like we were convinced that they knew what they were talking about. And so this, I just would say that about this project, and we took that into account when we were coming up with their budget.
Okay, hearing no discussion, I will move us right along. The next program is Legal Aid at Work, which is also a QLSP. Their project is statewide, and it scored an 81 on the rubric. Their project focuses on emergency income stabilization to prevent homelessness. And so their legal services are actually more targeted toward helping folks receive unemployment insurance, disability benefits, paid family leave, those kind of income stabilization and therefore housing stabilization benefits rather than direct homeless or housing legal services. And I actually believe they scored below in the project impact because it wasn't as direct a nexus to homelessness prevention. We thought that the argument was compelling, but because so many other projects were focused specifically on housing legal services, they did take a hit in that category. However, they made up for it in several of the other categories, as I'll walk you through. So they scored and exceeds in serving rural communities because their focus is in and around Watsonville, and their partners have on-site clinic locations in rural areas. And then they exceeds expectations on underserved communities because they're particularly focused on serving farm workers and low-wage workers, immigrant and refugee communities, as well as monolingual Chinese speakers. And so they had really specifically and clearly defined kind of pockets of particularly underserved communities that they were hoping to reach across the state. And their total request was 924,000. We recommended 700,000, and that was because they had higher administrative costs than some other programs in their budget. And then like CILS, they had less quantified deliverables, or not as well quantified deliverables as some of the other budgets. And so they took a little bit of a hit on their budget for that. But then when we asked how their deliverables might need to change if they received the lower funding, they said that their deliverables would not change. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, I will move on. The next project is Public Counsel, which is a QLSP. Their project would be in Los Angeles, and they scored an 80. And this project is focused on foreclosure prevention and bankruptcy legal services via a clinic setting. This was one of relatively few projects that was focusing on foreclosure prevention for homeowners, which we were impressed by. And then they have their partners would be doing educational outreach and helping kind of grow the expanse or the scope of the project in that way. For focus on rural, they got a MEETS because it is in Los Angeles County, but they are focusing on Antelope Valley region of LA County. And then they received a MEETS for underserved communities because they mentioned serving Black and Indigenous and people of color, older members, older adults, and then monolingual Spanish speakers. So they kind of identified a couple different groups that are particularly underserved in the greater community that they would serve in this project. They asked for almost the maximum, very close to 1.5 million, just under, and we're recommending funding at 1.25 million. And the only thing that I had noted when looking at their budget was they had slightly higher actual benefits for their personnel, which is not in and of itself a bad thing, but they were much higher than some other programs. And then when we asked how their services might change if they received around 1.25 million, their numbers of clients served changed a little bit. So they originally proposed serving 2,000 clients, and with that budget cut, they said they would serve closer to 1,650 clients. And then they were hoping to do pro per services, or help folks doing pro per with the foreclosure prevention specifically, I believe. And that number would go from 640 clients down to 530. So their numbers would change a little bit.
And I'd also like to point out that this is a good example of one of the issues that I think was raised earlier when we were talking about the scoring rubric and including rural as a scored point. I think it was raised by Christian and also by Herman, that they were worried that too many of these grants would be going to just rural counties and not to urban areas. And this one is serving not only South and East LA, which have large minority communities, but it's also doing a special outreach to a non-state bar funded partner in Antelope Valley. And it's one of several. And if you look at the map that's at the end of the materials, you see that LA County is being served by 5 of these proposals, most of which support not only LA city type programs, but also the Antelope Valley area. So it's, as it turns out, in terms of our allocation, it's all the money's not going to Yolo County and nothing going to LA.
Eric has his hand raised.
Yeah, so are these clients homeowners?
I believe so, at least some of them, because it is foreclosure prevention and bankruptcy legal services. So I suppose the bankruptcy legal services, you would not need to necessarily be a homeowner, but for the foreclosure prevention, yes.
So how do they meet the indigency test?
That is a great question.
That's
So
not,
I just like,
it's not asset based though.
It's not?
mm-mm.
It's just income based?
It's income based.
Yeah, Christian has it exactly right. It's the Business and Professions Code definition that applies to these grants as well. And it just looks at income as tied to federal poverty thresholds or age.
So wait, so a retiree with $10 million in net worth but no income could qualify for legal services?
Well,
Well, but that's true if you're disabled.
and all folks over age 60 or 65
Yeah,
are
65.
indigent statutorily anyway, regardless of income.
The only thing that doesn't, and that's like the business professions code definition. The only thing that I don't have top of mind for me is if the commission has in the past adopted a rule that requires looking at assets notwithstanding the way the statute, the definition is in the statute. I just don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I don't know if Dwan is still on, but she's planning to, if she's had to step off, she's going to come back and she will know that off the top of her head, so we can ask her.
I mean, I don't think it's that, like, personally, I don't think it's a huge problem or anything. I don't think we're, and if you're going to be over inclusive versus under inclusive, I guess it seems like a easy call for me anyway.
And I can't, I'm sorry, Danielle, I just can't remember all the specifics of this proposal because we split the batch sheet. She kind of reviewed the details of one half, I did the other half. But since the legislature put in foreclosure prevention this year, I think maybe where it was coming from was, someone might have had an income, they purchased a house, and the fact that they're going through foreclosure now means that their income situation might have changed. They're about to lose their house. So it could reflect like a change in their financial circumstances such that
they'll have to meet the indigent. They will have to certify that their clients meet whatever the indigency test is. So
that's right. Yeah.
Whatever, that's fine.
Yeah, and Chris, to answer your question, I don't recall the commission ever looking at assets for a qualifying factor. I could be wrong.
I think you're correct.
Yeah.
We've never done that as far as I know. And remember, we had a major foreclosure prevention grant a couple of years ago. So by definition, these were all homeowners.
That's right.
The bank grant, or at least the first iteration.
The first one, yeah.
I think homeless insecurity as measured by our Times poll published this morning amongst homeowners is extremely high.
That's right. Unfortunately, yeah.
Okay,
I'm good with this, Chris.
Should we move on?
great. So the next project is Housing and Economic Rights Advocates. And again, this is the organization that is planning to partner very closely with CRLA. So it is a QLSP. They are also planning to serve Monterey, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, and Ventura counties. They scored a 75 on the rubric. And so that project in its totality with both programs is doing wraparound legal services, holistic homeless prevention, full scope eviction defense in Central Coast. What HERA would be doing specifically is addressing habitability, discrimination, and harassment and pre-UD notice work in landlord-tenant disputes. And so they received a meets expectations for rural communities because the counties listed include those rural urban mix counties. And then for underserved, they also received a meets. They identified a couple different communities that they would like to serve through this project, which includes seniors, people of color, immigrants, and households with minor children. And then they asked for the maximum amount of 1.5 million. We recommended 1.1 million. There were some minor, part of that was because it was like because it is this partnership with CRLA, we looked at them together a little bit, and that, CRLA is being pretty generously funded. This is also being reasonably generously funded. So together that project seemed pretty sound. There were some minor budget, I don't want to say errors, but they didn't fill out our budget tables to the level of detail that we usually expect. And so they got a little bit more of a haircut than CRLA did, for example. Because of that, we were just a little less impressed with how they filled out their budget materials. Not that there were necessarily inaccuracies in them, just the level of detail provided. And then when we asked how their deliverables might change given if they received a grant around 1.1 million, they said they would hire 2 attorneys instead of 3, and then their clients served would decrease from 350, which I believe is annually, to 260. So they would serve 90 fewer clients per year. Yeah, Banashe?
Thank you. So just for clarity, CRLA and San Bernardino, where are they overlapping? Where are they partnering? Is it the totality of their grant proposal or some portions?
So CRLA and Housing and Economic Rights Advocates are serving.
Sorry, Housing and Economic Rights.
Yes, yeah. So they're serving the same counties. It's the same, or they're partnering in the project. I believe each QLSP is taking kind of slightly different portions of the actual legal services being provided. So CRLA is doing the full scope eviction defense and also the record clearing component of that, whereas Housing and Economic Rights Advocates are doing the pre-UD work, including addressing habitability, discrimination, tenant or landlord discrimination, harassment, kind of anything that comes before they get that UD or eviction notice.
So they partner through the chain, through the process, but they don't overlap.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I can move on to Immigrant Legal Resource Center. So this is a support center, which I believe is the first that we've talked about so far. They are proposing to serve particularly Fresno County, Madera, Merced County, San Joaquin, Stanislaus, and Tulare counties. And they scored a 75 on the rubric. They are proposing to focus their project on improving economic stability through immigration status, employment authorization, and public benefits. They received and exceeds on the rural category because they're working with service providers in San Joaquin Valley, Madera, those different very rural counties. And then they received and exceeds on underserved communities because they're specifically focusing on undocumented immigrant survivors of domestic violence. So again, this is a project that may have scored slightly lower on project impact because it's not specifically housing legal services. It's again that focus on economic stability through immigration status, employment authorization, public benefits work. But they scored very highly on both rural and underserved because of the very unique and well-defined population they are hoping to serve with these funds. And this was a much smaller budget proposal than most, and I think the smallest, one of the smallest. They asked for $475,353. We recommended funding at $300,000. And again, this was a project that was less clear on their number of deliverables and their client numbers. And so that was part of the reason that they received a steeper budget cut. And then when we asked how this would impact their deliverables, they said they would scale back the number of clinics. They were doing these services in a clinic setting. And I don't have in my notes, so I don't think they quantified by how much they would scale back those clinics, but they would hold fewer of them and therefore serve fewer clients. There are a couple hands raised. I think Christian was first.
So I guess I would just note two things. One is because of the modesty of this particular proposal, this cut is pretty steep. So I guess was listening to your rationale for the cut. But the second thing is that I would just note that this is a constituency that the legislature was particularly interested in addressing with this money. And to me, like, part of the, I guess I would call it an ancillary benefit of this type of program or service is that by being present in the community and doing these clinics, you are essentially creating sort of a track record of credibility and a momentum toward service in this community and toward access and toward utilization by the community itself with sort of trusted partners. So I don't know, I could see reinstating some money into this one.
I agree with Chris. Oh, wait, Daniel, go ahead with the other raised hands.
Sure, yep, Bonafide.
Yeah, echo everything Chris just said, as well as, I think one of the things that we may want to start to look at, now 2 organizations have highlighted this issue, which is there are communities that literally you cannot get that data for. And this is going back to my past of immigrant work, immigration rights work with a particular group of folks, which wouldn't come forward after 9/11. So it's really important for us to have the sensitivity internally to be able to manage how these organizations come back to us when we're asking a very, very important question, which is data and impact and reach. Like we want all of that, correct? So we could go back hopefully for more funding for these organizations, but also we should keep in mind that there are communities that these organizations are serving that they will not be able to give us those numbers. And we shouldn't be using that lack of information against them, but rather understanding from our vantage point why they can't produce that. It really is special and specific to the areas that they're serving and the people that they are serving. But yes, I would agree with Chris. I think if not the full amount that they're asking, pretty close to the full amount is what we should be considering here.
This is a 37% cut in a program that is grouped in a category where there were more 75s than any other. And there are steep cuts all along this list. But I would agree with Bonafide and Chris that we ought to restore some money to them in their grant. If we have $100,000 thus far to apply, we can apply some of that.
Apologies, I needed to step away to use the restroom. So I can make a note in the changes column for a potential increase. Are we on ILRC still, or are we on Justice and Aging?
We're on ILRC, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I won't speak for the full scoring committee, but I would be very comfortable increasing that one as well. There's nothing that I saw that would make me hesitate to do that.
I thought, just speaking for myself, I thought all of the support centers, the 4 support centers that are in here, had really strong proposals. And I think they all were on the more modest side of what they asked for. Oh, maybe not Justice and Aging, but ILRC certainly was. One Justice is kind of in the middle.
Yeah. And that's a fair thing to mention actually too, and that I think one thing that we noticed in looking at the proposals from the support centers was overall they were slightly less detailed in providing numbers of clients, and that may be in part due to the nature of support centers. And so I absolutely hear the committee's point that some of it in this case may be related to the client population. It's actually very likely related to the client population, but it may also be related to their position as a support center. Okay, I can move on to Justice and Aging, which is also a support center. And because it's a support center, they're proposing a statewide project and they scored a 75%. So their project, their proposal is to convene legal service providers, QLSPs, to strengthen capacity of homelessness prevention services statewide for the elderly specifically, and address systemic housing related problems for older adults in California. And so we scored this project as a meets for serving rural communities, because while it is a statewide project, they did indicate a special focus on rural areas. And one of the steering committee of this convening would specifically include QLSPs serving rural communities to make sure that that continues to be a focus of the group. And then for underserved, we said, we scored it as exceeds expectations because it is focusing on Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the older community, as well as older immigrants and tribal elders were specifically noted. And then this program, they budgeted 915,000, and we proposed 600,000. So this is another one of the steeper cuts. And we wrestled with this one a little bit because the impact was a little less clear because of its position as a support center, and because the program is the project is a convening to kind of build statewide capacity. It still scored well, clearly, and so we were convinced that they could do it and do it well, but the measurable outcomes are less clear for something like a convening, which is reflected in their steeper budget cut. And then when we asked how this budget cut would affect their deliverables, they said that they would convene 4 meetings per year instead of 6 in their original proposal. They would hold 2 trainings annually, when they had originally proposed doing 2 to 3 trainings a year. And then they would create 1 to 2 written reports or materials annually when they originally proposed to do at least 2. So their annual deliverables in meetings, trainings, and written products for QLSPs would decrease slightly.
Danielle, isn't it fair to say that support centers are going to have a much more difficult time in convincing us of their deliverables when we are focused on the number of clients they touch?
I think that's fair. And I think we, as a scoring team, we wrestled with how to handle that, because we didn't want to necessarily penalize support centers simply because they're support centers. But when we are trying to measure or compare or score projects on the impact of those interventions, we found it harder to do that with support centers because they're, a couple more steps removed, particularly for a project like this that's kind of focused on a convening and trainings.
Right. My view of this one was, once again, that it's a fairly steep cut. And how did they respond when you asked them about this 34% cut?
Yeah, so they they said they would decrease their number of meetings. So originally the convening, they expected to meet 6 times a year, and they decreased that to 4 times a year. They were originally planning to do 2 to 3 trainings statewide on homelessness prevention services, and they decreased that to 2 trainings. And then the written deliverables that they proposed decreased from at least 2 to 1 to 2. So we saw that decrease in number of convenings, trainings, and written documents.
I'd like to see an increase in this.
I agree. I'm sorry. I was off camera so that I could grab a bite, but I agree with Rich.
All right, I will move on to the next project, which is Legal Aid Society of San Bernardino, which is a QLSP in San Bernardino County. And this project scored a 75% with the scoring rubric. And the focus of this project is providing legal services to victims of domestic violence and elder abuse. And those services would include counsel and advice, case document review, document prep, and then as needed, some eviction action assistance. It was a little less kind of traditional eviction defense and UD work, and more, again, counsel and advice, document review, document prep, slightly lower levels of service provision in that respect. They received a meets expectations on the rural communities row of the rubric. Again, they would be serving San Bernardino, and they also mentioned reaching into Riverside County and helped serve remotely via virtual platform. So there was some kind of reach into the rural communities, but it wasn't in person in the same way that some other programs laid it out, which is why they got a meets instead of an exceeds. But then they did get an exceeds for underserved communities because of that specific focus on victims of domestic violence and elder abuse, which we found compelling. So their total budget request was the maximum of 1.5 million. We are proposing a budget of 1 million, or a grant of 1 million. And part of that was they actually had very high numbers, client numbers in their proposal. And I didn't note them, but I can look at them while we're chatting. But they were almost, I don't want to say they were too high, but we were concerned about the program's ability to reach those high case numbers. And so that was part of the reason that they got a slightly lower budget. We weren't sure if they would be able to meet the case numbers that they provided in the proposal. And so when we asked how their deliverables would decrease with the budget decrease, they said that they would do 10 to 15 intakes per month, where they originally proposed 10 to 20. They would do 10 to 15 case evaluations per month. Again, they had originally proposed 10 to 20. That was the same for case preparations, would be 10 to 15 rather than 10 to 20. And then they would do 3 to 7 direct representations per month, when they had originally proposed 5 to 10. So for some of those lower levels of services, they had originally proposed 10 to 20 a month, and they decreased those to 10 to 15. And then for direct representation, it decreased from 5 to 10 a month to down to 3 to 7 a month. And Eric has a question or comment.
So I guess you found their client impact numbers not credible, or how high were they?
Let me double check. And so I have some of them in one of my column around changing deliverables. It looks like for a lot of these things, they were saying that they would serve 10 to 15 clients a month on several different levels of service. So intakes, case evaluations, case preparations. So I guess it was less that the numbers were higher than we believed, but it was a pretty broad range. When you multiply that out, that's like 300 to 600 clients a year. And I think that was something that we struggled with a little bit. Or I'm sorry, not a year, but multiplying it out, we were struggling with the wide range of the client numbers that they provided. I think is more accurate than saying that the numbers were higher than we thought they could maybe.
This is legal aid of San Bernardino.
Yes.
I pulled it up in my notes. So they, and I agree with everything Daniel just said. So they proposed to provide services to 420 to 840, they gave that range, unduplicated clients. And they broke that down into obtain a restraining order to prevent homelessness, which would be 10 to 20 per month. Prepare a written or oral assessment of the client's housing issue, 10 to 20 per month. Prepare a domestic violence temporary restraining order, unlawful detainer defense, or negotiate with landlords, 10 to 20 per month. There's 2 more. Provide direct representation on domestic violence restraining orders or unlawful detainers. So those are things were like document prep. So this is direct representation, 5 to 10 per month. And then the last one is their partner, Mary's Mercy Center, will provide 10 to 20 individuals with safe and stable housing and an individual assessment and service plan. I can't remember if Mary's Mercy Center is a sub-grantee, but a lot of them tended to just describe what their partners were going to be doing.
Yeah, so again, the numbers were high, but I think we also had some reservations about the range of client numbers being so large.
And they're a smaller program. So, if I had seen those kind of numbers from LAFLA or Inland Counties Legal Services or NLSLA or something, I'd be like, okay, yeah, they've got like over 100 attorneys, but this is like a much smaller program.
Eric, isn't this a program that we visited?
Yeah. It's the one that had substantial issues a couple of years ago, and they've gone through a management change. And yeah, I mean,
Well, my memory was that they had to depend in large part on pro bono in order to meet their legal services. And I think they've made a turnaround in large part due to the work the commission's done with them. And I want to support them if at all possible with a terribly underserved community program. But I think that the staff's recommendation seems to me right on. And I would support the numbers as presented.
So just a quick question, following up. Are there other funds going to them from the other pool, and how much, if any?
Yes, so they are receiving 468,500 from the formula. So yeah, almost 500,000 from the formula allocation for HP3.
Just so Tammy's aware of it, this program had financial difficulties, had an executive director that resigned with some questions as to how they had been performing in the past, and the commission had to dive in and work with them. Bonnie went out with us to work with them. And I think they have a board now dedicated to solving their problems. And I'm glad to see that they're getting a big award here. $1 million is a significant amount of money, and it would be, I think, extraordinarily impactful on their annual budget. So I think the number as presented of $1 million is, it seems right to me.
And then the other, the additional, sorry, Danielle, the additional nearly 500,000 is also going towards some of this work?
I am not sure. I don't know what they proposed to use their formula grant on. It of course would be homelessness prevention in some capacity, but I don't know if it's if this is an extension of that same body of work, or if it's slightly different services that I don't have on hand. We could certainly find out, but
yeah, that would be good to know. I'm in agreement with Rich to support this organization, particularly this location in San Bernardino. It's one of the reasons why the commission and the staff and Judicial Council took such interest in getting involved and wanting to support the organization. I am, though, optimistically cautious with the 1.5 million going in that direction. So with that said, I would support it, but still am cautious.
And then, oh, go ahead, Danielle.
I was going to say, just to clarify, they requested the full 1.5 million. We are currently recommending that they receive 1 million, so it would not be the full.
I understand. I'm just bringing in the formula amount as well.
Oh,
in my calculation. Yeah,
perfect.
Yeah, and Daniel's about to hand it over to me after LACLJ. So Daniel, if you want to wait to look up what their formula proposal was about, and then we can, like, during my piece, you can come back. But I will say for now, the list of permissible activities for the formula and competitive grant is the same. So it might be totally different work or a different community, but like it's the same list of what you can and can't do. And but they weren't allowed to supplant one grant with the other. So some projects did propose like an expansion with their competitive. So they said, like, here's what we're doing with the formula that we know we're getting. The competitive will build on it. And then they described how they build on it. And then other programs like, nope, this is gonna be a super different initiative. So I don't know for them, but we can find out.
Yeah, that's a great point. I can look it up after I hand it off to Chris. Great. Okay, and then the last project that I will present to you all is Los Angeles Center for Law and Justice, which is also a QLSP, and they are focused in Los Angeles. Unsurprisingly, they scored a 75 on the scoring rubric, and their project focuses on providing legal aid and social services to domestic violence providers. They scored meets expectations on the rural category because they also are planning to do some outreach into Antelope Valley through their partner, much like Public Council outlined. And then they received a meets expectations on the underserved community because of the focus on domestic violence survivors. In case you're curious why this was meets and some of the other domestic violence programs received exceeds, I believe they just didn't flesh out kind of why that community is particularly underserved in their application in the same way. We, of course, know why domestic violence survivors are less are underserved, but they did their write-up of that explanation in the application was not as strong as some other programs, which is why that received a meets expectations. They also requested the maximum of 1.5 million. We are proposing they receive 850,000. And then part of that is because they had much lower client numbers than some other projects this size. So it wasn't so much that they didn't provide numbers, they were just, again, much lower than some of the other projects that were asking for 1.5 million. And then when we asked how this change would affect their deliverables, it said it would decrease the number of clients served. I have in my notes that it would decrease to 114 clients instead of 200, and I believe that's annually, but I can double check.
And also want to point out that although they're also offering to go into Antelope Valley, like Public Council, that their partner, the non-state bar funded organization in Antelope Valley is different than the one that Public Council is using. So there's no overlap there.
The 43.
I've actually never heard of these people. Have we funded them? Yeah, Los Angeles Center for Law and Justice. Are they a longtime IALTA grantee?
They are.
Okay, I don't know how long they've been funded, but.
Yeah. Oh, I guess I don't know either how long, but for multiple years. They're smaller.
I think at least 10 because they're one of our Shriver grantees, and they had to have been an IALTA. So at least 12. I should say that because they've been funded for quite a while.
They do great work, but they kind of fly under the radar because they're small compared to the other LA program, the other LA grantees at least. I like to think of them as like mental health advocacy services. Like they have a very like small LA based, very niche focus.
Well, hearing no questions or comments, I can hand it over to Chris. And then while he begins, I will look up what LASSB is doing with their formula grant.
I have to take a 5-minute break. I'll be right back.
Great, yeah. Does the whole group want to take a 5-minute break?
That would be really great.
Is that okay, Jim?
Yeah, fine.
Or let's say, I guess, like an 8-minute break. We can come back at 2:05. So, okay, see you soon, everybody. Can you still see Jim and Danielle, the slides?
Yeah. I think we'll finish by 4.
I'm sure we will. I think it's really helpful to, I'm fingers crossed that we're going to finish by 3. We'll see. I think the bottom half of the list is like, maybe we'll go a little faster because they're just very straightforward projects and they're not getting, most of them aren't getting like quite as much money. So I think the stakes feel a little bit lower. We'll see if my prediction holds true.
I'm just really sorry that we didn't get more proposals for Northern California.
Oh, I mean, I can address that
Okay.
a little bit here.
When we have the meeting.
Well, I mean, I'll
that'd be
just
great.
point out that Lisnick didn't apply and
Yes, well,
yeah,
that's,
yeah. I know the map makes it look really sad, doesn't it? When you look
I
at the map?
know.
Yeah, you're like, look. We just like show the map and you just like cut off above the Bay Area.
Well, yeah, but don't forget there are statewide programs. So it's not like they're not served at all.
Yeah, I can make a note at the beginning because the way I think the public and concerned stakeholders ought to look at it is the formula grants and the competitive grants go hand in hand. It's like a package.
Yeah.
And like Lisnick is getting Legal Services Northern California is getting a formula grant. I'm pretty sure. Like, no, I should actually check. So Northern California is getting served by the whole HP funding scheme. It's just they didn't apply for competitive.
Yeah.
And
No,
you
I know. I just,
and of the 23 proposed programs that we're going to fund, I mean, 83% of them had a rural component.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I get that. It's a big part of the state that didn't apply.
It's very, yeah, with a lot of rural areas. At that. Jim, we're at 207, so I defer to you as to when you'd like to restart.
Are we ready to go or are people still off?
Let's see. I think we're ready to go. I think
Yeah, looks like
camera's
everybody-
on.
Okay.
I'm just checking something really quickly.
Chris, while you do that, do you want me to report on San Bernardino what I quickly found out about their
Yeah,
formula
that would be
grant?
great if we could like close the
Yes.
conversation on that one.
So as a reminder, with their competitive grant, Legal Aid Society of San Bernardino is proposing to provide legal services to victims of domestic violence and elder abuse, including counsel and advice, case document review, document prep. And they're hoping to do that or planning to do that in partnership with a court in San Bernardino. What they are proposing to do or will be doing with their formula grant is very similar. They hope to establish a site to deliver eviction defense, pre-eviction negotiation, and related services at the Central District Courthouse, but it's for all indigent persons. And so I think the services are very, very similar, both in partnership with a local courthouse. It's just that their formula work, that project will be available to all indigent residents, whereas their competitive grant application or project is focused specifically on victims of domestic violence and elder abuse.
Great, thank you, Danielle. Does anybody have any questions about, or Bonachet, like having heard what their formula project is about versus their competitive? Does that raise any questions for you?
I mean, there are some overlaps, but then there's the distinguishing factor that Danielle just also highlighted. So I'm okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Danielle. Welcome back from the break, everybody. We're gonna jump right back into it. So we left off with the legal aid of Sonoma County, but before I talk about that, somebody mentioned over the break, like, oh, you know, looking at the map, it's really clear that there's not any projects that focus specifically. We've got the 5 statewide projects, including like Inner Cities statewide online tool, but there's no projects that focus very specifically on the Northern California counties, except for like Legal Aid of Sonoma County, Legal Aid of Marin. But like once you get above that, the map is not shaded. And what sort of occurred to staff was, that's true, and it turns out that Legal Services of Northern California didn't apply for a competitive grant, in part probably because they're getting a $2.6 million HP3 formula grant. And I think they also got an HP1 and HP2 HP1 and HP2 homelessness prevention grants. So that just made me realize it might be worth pointing out that the HP grants, the first cycle, the second cycle, and the third cycle, and then also the formula plus the competitive, they all kind of merge together to be a multi-year, multi-pronged homelessness prevention funding stream, such that in this particular application cycle for HP3 competitive, LISNIC didn't apply, but Northern California is still getting a lot of HP funding if you look at it over the course of several years. So while we wish that we had more applicants from NorCal, it didn't seem like a cause for despair. But we do have a few here that are NorCal. They're just kind of close to the Bay Area. And so speaking of, Legal Aid of Sonoma County. So Legal Aid of Sonoma County is a qualified legal services project. It scored a 74. I believe it got an exceeds in underserved. Oh, actually, before I tell you even more, there's a common feature here with the remaining proposals, scores of 74 through 68. Something I noticed when I was reviewing this batch last night was I was looking at like where they got their exceeds and whatnot. These projects tended to either get a really high marks in project impact, and they were urban in their focus. So maybe they got 0 points or only 5 points or something in like rural, but they did really well in project impact strategies, organizational capacity, and or evaluation. So they still kind of rose to the middle of the group, the middle of the pack in their score, and would get funded. Or and for these ones, their project impact was actually on the lower end or maybe just moderate, but because they were rural and or very focused on underserved, they kind of rose to the middle of the pack and would still get funded. And that's actually, I think, a successful outcome of the scoring rubric, because the committee tried to make sure that the rubric meaningfully gave preference to rural and underserved, because that's what the statute said to do. And we're seeing that here with these scores of 68 through 74. Some of their case numbers are a bit lower. So they got kind of a middle, just maybe a meets in project impact and strategies, unlike an exceeds with a lot of the higher scoring ones, but they're very focused in rural or very tailored towards underserved communities. So I just wanted to point that out, because it's kind of a shift here as we dip below 75. Okay, so Legal Aid of Sonoma County's a QLSP. It got a 74 with an exceeds and underserved. It would focus on Sonoma County. So it's one of our only sort of NorCal focused ones. It would assist homeless and unstably housed veterans in obtaining benefits by modifying their discharge status when their discharge status is an obstacle to getting public benefits to which they're entitled. Such as by helping them to submit applications for benefits to which they're entitled. And that includes, for Legal Aid of Sonoma County, helping file appeals with the Board of Veterans Appeals. So it's a very focused project on one county, particularly underserved community. They do give like metrics for their deliverables, but I'll kind of just give you that high level description. The service area has significant rural parts, Sonoma County. And they scored well in the underserved because of the multiple dimensions of underserved that come with helping homeless and unstably housed veterans. We recommended almost their entire budget request because their budget was very fiscally conservative. We looked at it really closely, and there was nothing that we could see that seemed inflated or like they didn't give themselves a lot of a buffer. So. Let's give a second to think about Legal Aid of Sonoma County. Any questions or concerns? Okay. Let me know if I'm moving too fast, but I'm gonna.
Actually, Chris, real quick on Legal Aid of Sonoma, this is one where I think you thought that maybe they asked for too little.
We thought it's not that we looked at their budget and thought they messed it up so much as they could have asked for more. Like we probably would have been comfortable granting a higher budget request had they made it. As opposed to we looked at their budget and we thought that they like under budgeted for something they were going to need.
To your question, Eric, I was just thinking, I've had the good fortune of being on this committee for the last 3 years. And I was trying to think back, and if maybe Chris, I think you've been on it, Eric, I think you as well, if we've ever given more to, for a request. And this would be one of those that I would think we would want to give them more than what they requested for, but I don't know if we've ever done that in the past. But yeah, I'm glad that the staff and Jim thought to give them almost asking.
Yeah, that's where I was going with this. And I'm not saying we should necessarily, but they are one of the few Northern California projects. I mean, we'll just put it in there as something we can think about.
I just pulled up their budget, so to refresh my memory. So, almost all, they don't have any subgrants. It's almost entirely going to salaries for 3 years. And it's mostly attorney salaries. It's over the course of 3 years, it's over $500,000 would go to attorney salaries. They have a little bit in there for other staff and benefits. And then their non-personnel costs are very low, which suggests to me that it's funded by, they have other sources of funding that can supplement it. But it's like over the course of 3 years, their largest non-personnel cost is rent, and it's $6,000 per year. And then everything else is under that. And they have a little bit in there for admin personnel, but no admin non-personnel. It was a very tight budget. And I could look to see if they identified their other funding sources. It looks like they have $40,000 of non-HP3 funding in their budget to supplement it. So it was one where we didn't see where we would even encourage them to cut. Okay. So the next one is Community Legal Aid SoCal. Switch back to my notes. So Community Legal Aid of Southern California is a qualified legal services project. It scored a 73. I believe it got an exceeds in its organizational capacity to perform this work, and an underserved. It would focus on Los Angeles and Orange counties. So it was one of the very few programs that actually checked no to the rural box. They said they weren't going to really focus on rural. Their project is essentially a standard high impact homelessness prevention legal aid tenant assistance project. So they propose to hold over 100 Know Your Rights housing events that will be for 774 attendees, including eviction defense clinics. They're going to do 120 eviction defense clinics. They propose to help 480 clients in Los Angeles and Orange County by providing counsel and advice or limited action in landlord-tenant rental disputes, and to offer at least 135 clients extended representation in landlord-tenant rental disputes. So it's a standard pure homeless prevention legal aid kind of textbook project. They said no to rural. They proposed to focus on Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color in Los Angeles and Orange counties. And we recommended a little bit under their request. So they requested 1.16 million, and we proposed 900,000. We did check in with them about that figure, to which they responded they would remove one of the two proposed community engagement liaisons. So they, instead of hiring two, they'd keep one from this grant, and they would fund them through their other HP formula grant, as well as find other funds for them. And then they would probably shift their focus slightly more towards South LA and focus a little less on Orange County. But otherwise, they would keep their deliverables and work the same.
Might add, Chris, they also had a strong outreach to the Vietnamese community, along with bilingual liaisons.
That's great. Thank you, Jim. This was a pretty well-written proposal in terms of its level of detail. They always propose like extremely detailed deliverables for themselves. and explain everything very thoroughly. So this was a very reliable, I think this was a very reassuring
It's
proposal.
also a high level of predicted clients too. Those numbers are high.
They are.
I mean, I wonder whether we shouldn't at least jot them down for a possible increase.
And they are one of the major players, only major players in Orange that serves Orange County, even though they said they would pay particular attention to South LA, which I think is like
yeah, I'm
Compton.
glad you just, I'm glad you just mentioned that, Chris, because that I don't think we have others that are focused on that county.
Yeah, there is one other. There is the
There
Public
is?
Law Center.
Yeah. But the Public Law Centers is you're about to hear, is really focused on a particular housing need in Orange County. That their project is focused on mobile home owners. And Community Legal Aid SoCal, I don't think they coordinated on this, but Community Legal Aid SoCal is focused on tenants. So they actually wouldn't overlap very much, if at all. Okay. National Housing Law Project. So this is another support center. I think this is our third of 4 support centers. So it scored a 73. It got an exceeds on org capacity. Again, towards this area in the scores, they tended to get just like maybe 1 exceeds, maybe not. Maybe they got meets across the board, but scored high in special. So they got an exceeds in org capacity. This is very much within their wheelhouse as a national support center that focuses on housing law. They proposed something that was very comfortable for them. It would be a statewide project, as I think probably all the support center projects are. Their intervention is, and I'm just going to quote it from their project abstract: to assist California advocates, legal aid advocates, legal services organizations, and government entities in the implementation of new federal funding and new federal housing programs. So they propose to focus their efforts, their technical assistance and guidance on small cities and rural areas to ensure that programs reduce new federal programs reduce evictions, preserve tenants' rights, and serve the most vulnerable families in California. And then there's suite of interventions as standard support centers. That's trainings, technical assistance, litigation where they co-counsel with the QLSP, public policy briefs, and the other support center work. So their rural hook is that they're statewide, and they propose to sort of focus their efforts on small rural communities. This was a proposal that the scoring team actually went back and forth on, and was desiring greater specificity in like exactly what their intervention would be, but it ended up being the only, everyone was comfortable giving it a meet. So it ended up being one of the only support center projects that was just pure helping all the legal aid organizations and cities that are amenable to it to just sort of understand how to maximize federal funding opportunities and regulations to reduce homelessness throughout the state, versus like Justice and Aging, ILRC, and One Justice had very focused niche interventions. And so we wanted to make sure that we included this one. And we gave them very close to their budget request for a similar reason that we did for Legal Aid of Sonoma County. It was a very modest budget. And when we read through the narratives, there wasn't really anything that seemed like fluff. It seemed like what they would actually need. It was one of the smaller budget requests too. Okay. Public, and again, let me know if I'm just going too fast. So Public Law Center. So this is the other Orange County program. So they're a qualified legal services project, like Community Legal Aid SoCal is. They scored a 73 as well. They did actually get an exceeds on project impact, and they got an exceeds for their focus on underserved. So they would, whereas Community Legal Aid SoCal also proposed to serve South LA, kind of the Compton area, Public Law Center will focus exclusively on Orange County. They had we gave them an exceeds on project impact because they had a particularly unique, and we thought compelling focus. They were the only one to propose services focused on mobile home owners. So it's they tend to be a lower income bracket of homeowners. So what they propose to do is to expand legal services to low income mobile home owners in Orange County, they would focus on sort of systemic issues in mobile home parks, like issues of habitability, mobile home, if there's like abuses from the person or the company that owns the mobile home park towards the mobile home owners, if they're not maintaining the park, if it's unsafe, and to do that by direct representation. I suppose unlawful detainers arrives in the context of mobile home ownership, know your rights trainings, community education, and outreach. So it wouldn't be rural. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, there's Orange County, like San Francisco County, is one of 2 counties that have no rural areas at all. But what was particularly unique in this proposal was that there's a movement in Orange County to buy up the mobile home parks by private equity firms, who then want to turn around and eliminate the mobile homes and use the property for more valuable purposes. So this has a big countywide potential impact.
Yeah, so they talk about what are I learned about the legal issues that apply to mobile homeowners. So they talk about failure to maintain issues, both individual space and park-wide issues, and unlawful detainer issues. And they propose to provide the full range of interventions from limited to full scope representation. And they got in exceeds and underserved because they said that they would especially focus on Orange County's significant Latinx and Vietnamese American communities, especially if they had limited English proficiency. And Jim knew that that was actually something that was within their expertise to provide. Is that correct, Jim?
Yeah. I used to be on the board, but no longer.
So Public Law Center, we recommended almost their full ask. We thought their budget was reasonable. Unlike some of the really big legal aid providers that might be getting significant federal funding, they were one that we thought their capacity to make up for a shortfall was much smaller. So if we were to come back and tell them you're only going to get 80% of your ask, they might actually have to just reduce their deliverables by 20%. Like there's no, we can find another funding source to offset that. So for them, we recommended because the budget seemed reasonable, we recommended just about the full amount. Okay. All right. Bay Area Legal Aid is a qualified legal services project. This is one that is, and I'll just forecast ahead. This is going to be the same thing with Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles and also Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. They're 3 very big, very effective legal aid providers. They all kind of scored in the low 70s, not because their projects were lacking impact. And in fact, that's why they scored high enough to be recommended for funding, but because their focus is primarily urban, and the rubric needed to give preference to rural and underserved. So these projects are still very high impact and articulated a compelling focus on underserved, but the rural hook was weaker. So Bay Area Legal Aid got a 71. It did get an exceeds on its organizational capacity. This is an expansion and continuation of existing work that would that some of which would have to sunset if not for additional funding. And it's very much within their expertise. So Bay Area Legal Aid will focus on Alameda and Contra Costa counties. It has kind of like 2 pieces. It's standard tenants' rights, homelessness prevention legal aid. The Alameda tenant rights line, the tenants' rights hotline, would continue to help low-income renters retain their housing by providing high volume access to legal services, related financial assistance, public benefits, income maintenance type work, and representation in housing matters. It proposes to serve about 300 tenants per year, and to do at least 6 Know Your Rights presentations, I think, per year. And then the second piece is the Contra Costa County Medical Legal Partnership, which is for Tammy, like a medical legal partnership is usually when a legal aid, a classic example is when a legal aid will partner with a hospital or a doctor's office. It's so that the staff at the medical facility can refer patients to legal aid when they notice an intersecting legal medical issue. Like if someone comes in, the textbook example is they come in with like mold inhalation from where they live. The doctor might say, you should talk to legal aid about your tenant's rights to have the mold removed from your apartment. And then the medical legal partnership sort of enable those sorts of referrals. So their Contra Costa County MLP aims to help people experiencing or at high risk of homelessness to access and retain safe, stable housing by providing, medical, legal, coordinated advocacy. So that project will handle 60 cases per year, providing a range of legal services, including advice and counsel, limited scope assistance, and full scope representation. We came in a little lower. So they saw a little over $1 million, and we recommended 800,000. And this was purely because we thought Bay Area legal aid, it's not that their budget was inflated in any noticeable way, but just that they would have an easier time, one, making up for the shortfall with other funding sources, or two, their numbers were high enough that if they did have to reduce them a little bit, we thought it would still be an impactful project. And they did come back to say that this approximately 20% reduction would likely lead to having the principal attorney position reduced from 1 FTE, 1 full-time position, to a 0.8 FTE. So I think that's that's equivalent of about 4 out of 5 business days per week working on this project. And they would consider reducing their proposed deliverables, like the 300 clients per year, by 20%. So the scoring team thought that if it came to that, that would be reasonable. Bonachet.
So we're aware that there are other funding sources.
Just that they're a particularly well-funded provider as a legal services corporation, basic field grantee, and then Daniel, do you happen to have their formula grant figure in front of you? If not, I'm gonna look it up right now.
I don't. Sorry, I took my
Nope, that's okay. You're
video
entitled
off
to take a break.
eating a snack.
It's
but,
my turn to perform. I'm just looking it up right now in the appendix. Let's see. Area.
I think they get 995,000.
You found it.
The formula.
Yeah, you beat me to it. Yeah, they're getting almost $1 million in the HP3 formula allocation. Any other thoughts about the area legal aid? So we thought a 20% reduction in the deliverables was like, okay, that's still a really impactful product. It didn't get to the point where we're like, well, that's not worth funding anymore.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking maybe a small increase. I'm not really sure what that number would be. And I'm thinking of that relative to some of the other organizations that we've discussed thus far. And I understand that they're a large organization, they're well funded, but in particular, we were discussing a little earlier that we don't have a large Bay Area contingency when we have Sonoma County, we have some other Northern Californians, just to support their reach. But I'm not, I don't have a figure in mind, just a thought that potentially a bit of an increase.
Great. All right. So I noted that. So I think we'll come back and talk about each of these ones where we suggested a
Yeah,
change.
that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so for legal aid of Marin. So this is kind of similar to the legal aid of Sonoma County and its approach and focus and size of budget. So legal aid of Marin is also a qualified legal services project. It scored a 71. It would focus on Marin County only. And it proposes to provide housing legal aid to at least 200 additional COVID-19 impacted tenants that are living in Marin County. And that would include the standard suite of limited and full scope representation, consultations, et cetera. And they would also expand their community-based trainings, their monthly trainings in partnership with, and then they list several Marin based partners: Phoenix Project, North Marin Community Services, Community Action Marin, Canal Alliance, West Marin Community Services, to make sure that they reach at least 200 tenants and landlords with Know Your Rights information each year. So it was a smaller scale project. It's focused on one county. Their numbers weren't quite as impressive as some of the bigger funded organizations, but it was one of the only ones that would serve this county, and it was a very well drafted proposal. The service area is at least partly rural, and they did articulate a focus on Latinx and Black residents of Marin County.
As well as farm workers too.
And farm workers.
In Western Marin.
And this might be our absolute smallest budget request. I could be wrong about that, but if I am, I'm not wrong by a lot. They asked for only $360,000 for 3 years. And so for that, the scoring team thought for that, $120,000 per year to significantly expand homelessness prevention in this one county was, given the thoughtful nature of their proposal, was reasonable. Okay. We're making good time, so I'm just going to keep us moving. So Neighborhood Legal Services. Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles County is their full name. It's a qualified legal services project. They scored kind of like LAFLA just below them, and even like Bay Area Legal Aid 2 above. They scored a 71. They would focus on LA County. We were very intrigued by this project. It is high impact in numbers, but it takes a different approach. So they articulated a very compelling, citing several studies, compelling project that would sort of focus on the intersection of medical debt and healthcare access to homelessness. So they cite several studies about how the number of people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness that have astounding medical debt, and how that can both contributes to their being at risk of homelessness or keeps them in poverty. And so they would try to help address LA homelessness by making sure that they're helping people address medical debt, access to healthcare, and other public benefits to which they're entitled. So it wasn't like just like Community Legal Aid SoCal, which was just pure landlord-tenant law. This was approached it from a different angle, which we thought was great because I think Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, the next one, took more of a traditional approach. So it contributes to maybe not overlapping quite as much. Their numbers were pretty high, so I won't necessarily give you all the numbers, but essentially, they're going to make sure they do aspire to do outreach and education events for over 1,000 clients in LA County each year, which, given the size of organization, we think they can actually do, and otherwise to serve with their partner at least 600 individuals per year, which again, given their size, we think they can do, and that includes working on 360 administrative hearings, offering representation 360 administrative hearings per year, and other brief services and counsel and advice matters. They did articulate a rural focus, and I'll invite Jim to, because I think LAFLA did something similar. I'll invite Jim to weigh in here on how much weight we wanted to put on this, but they did articulate a focus on the Antelope, San Fernando, San Gabriel, and Pomona Valleys, parts of Los Angeles County. It's hard to make an argument that LA County has significant rural areas, but they tried to do that. What we did find convincing was they would focus on particularly underserved communities by focusing on those people with disabilities, older adults, people of color, and those who have limited English proficiency. But Jim, I don't know if you want to weigh in on the LA County rural.
Yeah, they really took an overly expansive definition of rural. Most of the areas they mentioned were not technically under medical services study areas, rural areas, except for Antelope Valley. Northern Antelope Valley is rural. And so to that extent, but they were really fudging their definition.
So I don't think we gave them high, they get in exceeds in rural. They sought 1.5 million and we recommended 1.1 million for 2 reasons, if I remember correctly. One was we thought that their other funding streams, including the HP3 formula grant, would make it would soften the blow of this shortfall. And then the other one was because we were impressed by their healthcare debt and healthcare access perspective on homelessness prevention and thought it worth funding. We also sort of thought, you know, it's one small step removed from pure landlord-tenant work or housing work. They cite really compelling studies and whatnot, but we felt a little more comfortable maybe not giving them their full ask because it was close to what someone might think of as homelessness prevention legal aid, but you have to they're going to have to be extra careful to make sure they're explaining all along how the people they're helping are at risk of homelessness, how this particular healthcare access and healthcare to issue is contributing to homelessness, and to keep it a homelessness prevention focused project. So we didn't want to go all in on the funding for this one.
Chris, I looked at this one, I thought it was really innovative, and it, as opposed to some of the other proposals, and it truly attacked one of the major causes of homelessness. You know, in the past, Chris has more than others, Chris Schreiber, has looked to these programs to be innovative, and I thought they should have been rewarded for that. This is a 27% cut. And I'm not sure they shouldn't get some more and be rewarded for their approach.
Hi, Dwan.
Hi, sorry, I'm back. You know, the loss, and I know we've had this conversation before in another iteration of the HP meeting. If you look at the map, we are funding, I believe it's 4 or 5 LA projects. So I think that also went into the calculus of like how much money is being poured into the LA County specifically. To us, you know, inner city law center scored very high, the highest. And so that's why we felt like it was a little bit deserving of more money. And so, you know, though Chris was had pointed out early on, we didn't always take the score. We didn't take the scores into consideration, but I think having that kind of global perspective is helpful in doing the budget.
Thank you. Christian.
I just was going to echo Rich's points very quickly about the innovativeness, and would just note that, you know, one thing I appreciated about this application was that they actually did try to identify a source and then go to that source of the homelessness, which I just felt was both unusual among these applicants, and also very interesting. And I think it could yield fairly sort of studyable results. So I wanted to sort of shout that out because I think we should watch this one kind of closely.
Chris, would you then agree with Eric, I'm sorry, with Rich for an increase on that one?
I mean, I hear what Juan's saying about LA County. I mean, I sort of trust staff's take on this, given how much money's going there, but it is sort of the locus of a lot of homelessness. So
I think over 25% of Californians live in LA County. Is that? I feel like someone actually knows that for sure, but I think it's over a quarter of the state lives in LA County.
Yeah.
Well, if you run the formula, it's like 25% is in LA County. So, I mean, we could increase it for now. I mean, it seems like, I'm sorry, I'm joining back what you guys have already finished most of this, but there's going to be some shuffling, some decreases, some increases. So there might probably be room with some shuffling to increase that up, like 100,000. Does that feel comfortable?
Well, I don't know if we have 100 yet, but I do think we should note a potential increase here. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Chris, about potentially 25%, because looking at the map, you know, we're allocating 5 of the grantees to Los Angeles County, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a significant focus intention for Los Angeles County versus the rest of the state.
And I don't want to jump the gun, but I know we mentioned this before, but Eviction Defense Collaborative in San Luis Obispo, we ran out of money when we were allocating it, but I think it's also because based on the committee's feedback, EDC got bumped down, and that's why we ran out of money, not so much as we thought we would want to fund all of these, and we tried to distribute it. So that one got a really severe cut, and that probably should be brought up. But that's all to say, yeah, I agree. Maybe we should make a note for NLS to bump it up if there's money.
I did just look it up. It's over a quarter of the state. It's over 10 million people live in LA County. And then compare it to, we didn't look at county population. That simply was not a factor. But if you compare it to like San Francisco, which has 890,000, for instance, it's a lot more people live in LA County.
Yeah, it's also the epicenter of homelessness in the United States, the most visible area in the United States for the problem. And I think in the end, it's going to be an enormously important political issue. I don't think we need to debate, how we allocate money based upon that. And if you want to have an insight, read the book Everything Now, just came out about LA County's homeless.
Well, and there's also the formula that is allocated based on poverty rates. So
that helps. No. Okay, so the next, this is a good segue because LAFLA is also focused on LA County. Similarly large program. So Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles is a qualified legal services project. It scored a 70. It actually got an exceeds on project impact and would also focus exclusively on LA County. So they take a slightly more traditional landlord-tenant dispute approach, but they do have, and they got an exceeds because of their geographic focus and the sort of unique way they would approach it. So they would propose to create or expand their tenant empowerment and anti-harassment project. So they're focused on landlord-tenant harassment by landlords towards their tenants that threaten or increase homelessness. So they would seek to address and raise public awareness that would combat evictions, homelessness, and displacement by bringing affirmative tenant harassment lawsuits in LA City and County under the City and County's new tenant anti-harassment ordinances. And they would also pursue compulsory cross claims for harassment in defending limited cases for unpaid rent converted to a consumer debt under the COVID-19 Tenant Relief Act of 2020. So it was, and then they have pretty decent numbers. And so we appreciated that this was this would tackle homelessness in LA County from a different direction, which we really liked compared to NLSLA. And they do propose to focus on Black and immigrant renters, and to the extent that they can achieve a geographic focus, they would try and focus on Skid Row and historic South LA.
Yeah, I guess of the scoring group, I was the one that had the most problem with this for a couple of reasons. One is that we're already funding LA programs, and this is the only LA program that doesn't have any attempt at all to outreach to the rural areas. It's solely Skid Row and Southeast LA. And the other problem I had is that their focus was on tenant harassment suits and cross claims for harassment and defending unpaid rent. And my question was, and I don't know, and hopefully somebody else in the commission knows, but I thought Skid Row was primarily in a non-residential commercial area where people are living in tents. So I don't see how the tenant harassment suits would help Skid Row. I could see where it helps Southeast LA, but not Skid Row. And maybe it's because I just don't know the geography of Skid Row.
Jim, it does in fact impact the residential neighborhoods on Spring Street, Los Angeles Street, Main Street. It's a 16-block area. It has spread substantially from maybe what you last observed if you drive through the area. And the problem that they're attacking is a significant one.
Yeah, and when we were discussing it as a scoring team, the State Bar staff didn't have the we weren't totally sure, is there either a lot of tenants in Skid Row? We knew that there were some, but we were reassured by the historic South LA. So that kind of remained a slight open question for us too. They asked for 1,166,000, and we proposed 860,000. We kind of took a similar approach with NLSLA, Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles, in that they get a HP3 formula grant. I think it's pretty sizable, and they get significant federal funding. They could probably weather a shortfall. And we did ask them what might have to change if they got an award around $860,000. And it was a pretty modest change, we thought. So they said, we'll hire, they'll hire their 2 organizers as originally planned, at least 1 attorney. They'd proposed maybe hiring 2. They said we will reduce the number of the cases for which they enter into an retainer agreement by 1 case per quarter, which didn't sound like a lot to us. And they'll try to leverage other funding so they can keep the 2 organizers. Yeah, Danielle.
I was just going to mention regarding their formula allocation, LAFLA would receive or is receiving 2.48 million in HP3 formula funds.
So that's really helpful, and it has to be to do different work because it can't overlap by the statute. But it's still it's a particularly large award compared to what other programs are getting.
Thanks to people like Joe Lee and others at Munger Tolls, they have other sources of funding.
Yeah. So this is one where we thought it, and indeed when they responded back to us about whether they'd have to change the deliverables, they didn't seem to be very fazed by it. And they didn't come back with oh, that's a X% cut, so we'd cut our deliverables by the same percent. It was a very modest change, I thought. Okay. One Justice is our 4th support center of 4. So it scored a 70. And just so you know, a 70 was kind of got like a meets across the board, but they probably still did really well on special considerations. That's how you got into the 70 zone. So they would focus like the other support centers, they'd be statewide in their focus. It's a very support center type intervention. The committee looked at this, the scoring committee on November 22nd with this particular proposal, as well as EDC, which is the next one, and to seek input on their impact. So you may remember talking about it, but as a refresher, One Justice proposes to enhance the knowledge and capacity of QLSPs across the state to make data-driven decisions about homelessness prevention legal aid. And they articulate a 3-phase project that kind of starts with research into best practices and best practices in homelessness prevention delivery models, how to collect the data to sort of corroborate the efficacy of different interventions, so that QLSPs can then in phases 2 and 3 can design their homelessness prevention delivery models, whether they're getting HP3 funding or not. Anyone could be able to go to One Justice and get technical assistance on how to make sure that their interventions are actually helping to prevent homelessness in a meaningful way, because they're making data-driven decisions. And they would have a task force create a resource guide for legal services organizations, and present webinars. So that's kind of the refresher on them. They asked for $750,000. We looked at the budget. We looked at like how it would be staffed and sort of like the number of deliverables, like a webinar, how many people do you need to create a webinar, a resource guide, like these things to be done really well will take an enormous amount of time to research and vet. So it is a time-consuming project for sure, but we did look at their budget and we kind of thought, given the number of technical assistance instances they proposed, the number of webinars they proposed, $600,000 seemed more tailored to what the scope of what they were proposing to do. Okay, only 3 more. So the University of San Diego School of Law Legal Clinics is a qualified legal services project. It also got a 70. It would focus on San Diego County. It's one of our only ones, I think, down there. It's focusing on San Diego. I kind of think of this one as similar to legal aid of Marin and legal aid of Sonoma County. That's focused on one county, and the numbers are a little smaller than some of these bigger programs they're proposing, but it's still going to have a big impact in San Diego County. So they propose traditional landlord-tenant housing, homeless prevention legal aid, full scope legal representation, outreach, and community education, with a focus on undocumented indigent clients in landlord-tenant matters to prevent homelessness. So they propose to serve 50 indigent clients through educational workshops, outreach events, and/or direct legal representation every month. And this is a law school-based clinic, so that their volunteers are usually law students supervised by attorneys. Maintain an estimated active caseload of 20 to 25 unlawful detainer housing cases at any one time. And they would focus especially on the rural eastern portion of San Diego County. So that we thought that that was important. And we recommended just under their full ask. We thought their budget was pretty conservative. The only thing about USD's budget, and maybe some of the other law schools, and this always happens, is the school requires them to put in they have to put in a certain percentage of the salaries as sort of like an amount that the school takes off the top. This is pretty normal for them. So we did come in a little bit under their ask because it's always kind of a vague and significant line in the budget. And they did come back and say that at $800,000, they wouldn't have to change their deliverables. They thought they could still do it.
Chris, is this the only San Diego centric grant we're making?
I think so. I'm just pulling up the map right now.
I believe so.
Except for statewide ones, yes.
Right. Is there
Yeah.
any Imperial County coverage at all?
No Imperial County. Yeah, so I'm looking down at the bottom of the state. Well, LA has 5 focus projects. Orange has 2. San Bernardino has 2. Riverside has 1. San Diego has 1, and Imperial has 0. Okay.
That's a little concerning.
Yeah, Legal Aid Society of San Diego would have been our usual suspect for San Diego County, and they didn't apply for a HP3 competitive grant. I believe they applied for a formula grant. I don't know, Danielle, if you happen to have all 75 of the formula grantees up. But
No, yeah, I can get there pretty quickly.
I was gonna say some of the counties that aren't recommended is because there was an application. I can't say for sure all of them, but for some of them.
Yeah, Lisnick for NorCal,
Mhm.
and then San Diego, LASSD, Legal Aid Society of San Diego didn't apply. My guess, I'm pretty sure they're getting a pretty big formula grant. And I think we did hear from a couple of programs that they thought their HP3 formula grant was so big. They're like, we're gonna just focus on that project. And I think that might have been one of them that did that.
Yes, so Legal Aid Society of San Diego did apply for and receive HP3 formula grant. Actually, let me make sure I'm not still looking at HP2 since I was, no, this is HP3. And that is, sorry, I'm scrolling back down, 1.7 million, a little over 1.7 million.
Yeah, but they don't service Imperial County, do they? San Diego?
I don't believe so.
No.
Yeah, I think Imperial might be CRLA and CILS.
Right.
I think that's right.
Sorry, CRLA is California Rural Legal Assistance, CILS is California Indian Legal Services.
Bonnie,
But
what's the population of Imperial County? Is it more or less than Alpine? I would bet more.
I think it is more.
and it is the poorest county in the state.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's when this is an interesting the sort of like combination of formula and competitive together, because the map is just for competitive. It would be interesting maybe for like a HP Funds Committee meeting in the future to create the map that shows where funding is, to the best that we can figure it out, where funding is going when you combine the 2 grant streams together. Because definitely with the formula in there, it's a synthesized funding stream. It's the whole state is getting a lot of money.
That would be very helpful, I think, going forward, Chris, as well as maybe a column to show what formula funding each of these organizations are receiving.
The thing is, we could try to do that. It's not going to be exact though, because as you can see with some of these projects, they're proposing projects in multiple counties, and then they don't have a breakdown. Like they'll use X amount for this county. So we can kind of make our best guess, but that's the big caveat to those type of.
Yeah, because we don't ask them how much of it will go to this county or that county, but we do ask like, will you provide services there? You know.
And the population of Imperial is 181,000.
So it's sizable enough. That is the counted population. It's also got a border that's fairly porous.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people working in the fields there who are not documented. Yeah. So I don't want to appear before I used to appear before the state bar with a map. I don't know if you remember this one, but we did have where our money was going to make sure the trustees felt comfortable, especially those from rural areas.
Yeah.
And now the legislature is a different kettle of fish. We have to prove to those folks that our reach is going into areas that they represent. But so be it. We can't force people to make applications.
Yeah, and what will be interesting, and I'm probably jumping the gun, but in the next meeting or two, Chris and Danielle, they've already aggregated the data on the outcomes from the HP1 data. And so you'll be able to see directly tie our dollars to like counties by zip code. It's the first we've been able to do with any grant funding, but that should give you some insight into Imperial as well as other counties.
I forget, we also have IOLTA EAF funding as well.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
The question here was not about the quality or qualifications of this particular applicant, was it?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it started with a question of might they reach over and serve Imperial as well, and they didn't say they would. They're just focused on San Diego. So the next two both scored 68. I'll just say again, we originally were contemplating a cutoff at 70. It just kind of felt like the average score was 71. It felt like a neat cutoff. We originally were going to give everyone at 70 and above a little more, but then we realized EDC proposed a very compelling project for San Francisco that otherwise wouldn't get served. And then San Luis Obispo Legal Assistance Foundation proposed a very compelling project for their service area that I think maybe otherwise wouldn't get as many services. So we really wanted to include them.
Well,
we
and,
did.
Sorry, Kristen, I just want to add a little bit more about the EDC. You know, from the last meeting, based on your feedback, we actually bumped them down because the scoring team had EDC as it exceeds, and we bumped them down to meets based on all of your feedback. But so that bumped them down, but we still think that they should be funded. But again, it would be an open question about if you felt comfortable with the 68 and then the amount.
Yeah, so the scoring team went back after the 22nd, and when we adjusted their impact, I think they were at a 73 and it came down to a 68. The moment where the scoring team kind of heard the committee and actually made a material difference in the recommendation was they're still recommended for funding, but because they're at the bottom of the funded pool now, we lowered the funding recommendation by quite a bit. So that's why they have a $600,000 shortfall from what they asked for. And in the memo, we pointed out that we wanted to raise this as a question for the committee is because we did that. We changed them from exceeds to meets. And we lowered their funding recommendation quite a bit because of it. Did we cut too deeply, maybe?
Was this the Bayview Hunters Point?
Yes. So let me do a quick 20 seconds as a good refresher. So their EDC is a qualified legal services project. They did get an exceeds in their org capacity to do this work. It's just very much within their expertise. It would focus on San Francisco County, and they proposed to increase access to eviction defense legal aid for African-American tenants in San Francisco's Bayview neighborhood. The question that the scoring team brought to the committee on 22nd was that too narrow of a focus? Because it was like a neighborhood within one county. And they seek to interrupt what they describe as the disproportionate impact of evictions and homelessness for this historically excluded community, African-Americans in San Francisco's Bayview neighborhood. And they would do this by launching a community legal aid location on site in Bayview at their partner, the Housing Rights Committee of San Francisco's offices. This was a pretty deep cut, especially because this is a smaller program. So we reached out to them just to say, well, what would it look like if it was $900,000? And they actually did come back and say, and we weren't surprised by this, that would be a pretty, they'd really have to cut back on their deliverables. So they said with the 40% reduction in the amount of funding, they would still launch the Bayview Legal Housing Clinic on site, but it might only be open twice per week for all 3 years. The project staff will provide approximately 50 unduplicated clients with full scope legal aid in eviction matters, which can be very expensive for a small program to provide, combined with social work services, which was part of their original proposal. And it would still be on site at their partner. So they actually cut back their deliverables quite a bit, but we were expecting that.
I I was in the minority on this at our last meeting, but I thought this was a really good project. And the area is highly impacted. They're focusing on this area. They're a very experienced organization in this kind of work. I mean, I think we should fund them. I would actually suggest giving them more money.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think this was a little bit too deep of a cut, but the problem is that meeting was really close to the time that we had to post the materials. And so that's why we put a placeholder in the memo so that we could have a fuller discussion.
Yeah.
Hoping that you could find some money somewhere else to pull this up, you know, somewhat.
Yeah. And I'll do the last one, and then we're going to circle back and talk about moving money around.
Well, before you move on though, is there anybody else that has like a contrary feeling to Eric? And I think Eric is in agreement with the scoring team, but to what Eric's thoughts on the scoring team?
I support Eric's thought.
Okay.
I think he's right.
Great. All right, so our last one is SLOLAF, San Luis Obispo Legal Assistance Foundation. They are a qualified legal services project. They scored a 68 as well, and they would focus, and again, I could keep saying this over and over again, but they're kind of like Legal Aid of Marin, Legal Aid of Sonoma County. They're going to focus just on their county, so it's just San Luis Obispo County. It is they're one of the only ones in the recommended for funding pool that actually just takes a really strong, pure income maintenance approach. So which is the AB 164 contemplates as a homelessness prevention tactic. So they call it the Economic Justice and Outreach Project. It's to provide legal aid to individuals struggling with financial security who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. So they're going to check for that. And it will focus on helping people apply for or appeal denials of Social Security disability income, supplemental security income, food stamps, in-home supportive services, Medi-Cal. They list all of the major public benefits that are means tested in California. And their client numbers were, for their size of organization, made sense. It was kind of a smaller first year. It was like 60 clients, but these could be very like limited to full scope cases. 60 clients in the first year, but then up to 200 clients in years 2 and 3, each of those years. And they would partner with people to try and on the ground to try and reach. I want to say they were going to focus on, to try and reach undocumented immigrant populations, especially those that were monolingual Spanish speaking. And they designed their partnerships to try and facilitate that, which we appreciated. They had a pretty modest budget request for what the scope of what they were proposing to do, as the smaller programs tended to have. And so we actually, I don't know if I can speak for the full scoring team on this. I think we would have liked to have given them more. Like this is one where like kind of like Legal Aid of Marin, we might have liked to get closer to their budget request, but because they were at the very bottom of the funded pool, we literally just had about this amount of money left over. And so we also asterisked this one in the memo to say we kind of think it'd be great to give them a little bit more, but we want to defer to the committee because it would require taking money from someone else who got a higher score.
And I would like to add, Chris, that although it's a rural urban mixed county, unlike Sonoma, Sonoma is the same classification, but it only has about 18% that are of their poor or rural. In this case, 89% of the poor are rural. So it's, even though it's a mixed, it's a far more concentrated rural county.
We did ask them if $500,000 would greatly lower their targets, and they came back and they were like, they literally said, we don't anticipate that the deliverables will change all that much. But I kind of, and I don't want to take them at their word, but they're a smaller program, and I actually think that cutting them by this amount probably would be much harder for them to make up for that shortfall than it would for like one of the really big like LSC funded providers that's also getting like a $2 million formula grant. I don't know if Danielle, if you still have it up, but did SLOLAF apply for I think they did apply for an HB3 formula. It's going to be a lot less, I'm thinking.
Yes, they will receive the minimum formula award, which is $150,000
compared to like other programs that are getting like $2 million. So right. They said they wouldn't change their deliverables that much, but I feel like that's kind of small resource scarcity mindset is like really common among the smaller providers, where they say they'll try and make it work, but I kind of know that they could probably use the extra money if the committee can find it. So that's it. You've got so patient. We went through all 23. The goal now is just to settle on the funding amounts, or if you want to add, or if there's a program that didn't make the list you want to talk about, or one you want to take off the list. That's the agenda for the rest of the meeting.
And we got, as I read it, we got 7 programs that people want to increase, and we've managed to save 200,000. So.
Wait, 200. I'm looking at, yeah, possibly 200, right?
200.
Yeah.
And I
Maximum
did
100.
already remove the 100,000 from Intercity Law Center. This was 1,400,000, but we haven't taken it out yet from CRLA.
Okay. So the maximum is 200,000 that we can redistribute if you're all in agreement with the 100 for CRLA.
Well, I want to see if I can push back a little bit on San Bernardino. And I know that Rich is comfortable with the number, but I'm wondering if, given some of the kind of the history, if we would be comfortable with cutting just a little and adding
You know,
to
that's an interesting one. I remember during the review team, I took this one a pretty I gave them a pretty a sharp cut compared to some of our other review, but I do hear what you're saying. I think the review team agreed with my giving them kind of the historical background. This organization has struggled. Even $1 million infusion with a program. They have a great ED now, but they could use help on infrastructure. Is quite a bit. So if there is a cut, then that it might be. I would tend to agree with Bonachet. Maybe it's San Bernardino, because that's a lot of money for them.
This was the one that had the really high client numbers, where the scoring team was like, are they really going to serve? It's a big range. It's like 420 to 840 clients per year or something like that. I can't remember if it was per year. It was a lot. It's a small program. And we kind of thought, like, even if they don't get anywhere near, this was like more people than like LAFLA was planning to serve. Like, if they don't get anywhere near that, it'll still be a really impactful project for that region.
Yeah, well, when you go out there and you work with them and you see the line of people out in front of their office every day, and their intake processes are overburdened, I mean, you understand that they are serving a very large, poor community. But if we took 50,000 from them, I'd have no objection.
Would you have an objection if we took 100,000 from them?
I'd feel it was too big a cut. Yeah.
How about 75? I feel like we're negotiating.
I think you could take another 50 out of Intercity Law Center easily.
The Intercity Law Center?
Yeah.
I personally think if you're going to take from an LA program, it should be one that's scoring less, like NLS or LAFLA, that we've affirmatively scored less than Intercity Law Center.
LAFLA was cut by 27%. If you took them down to 800,000 or 810, you'd have 50 there and 50 out of LASB. I think that would be okay.
That was LAFLA, minus 50.
Well, let's do 50 to give us 100,000 to deal with. I'm not sure you're a tough negotiator.
I'm still at 75.
Yeah, I'd like you to find an Imperial County service here. We should get public counsel to open up an office down.
Yeah, exactly. But I do hear you, Eric. I think there's something there. How about the rest of some of these larger gives? I know Inland County, 1.3.
So I see an increase for NLS. Would you be open to keeping them as is or even cutting NLS?
I'm not comfortable cutting NLS.
Okay. Would you be comfortable with the 1.1 rather than increasing?
Sorry, actually, let's go back to that. That's the earlier statement I just made about NLS. Let me just look. Yeah, I'm not comfortable. I'm sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, it just occurred to me that I don't think I actually told you what NLS had to say about their proposed amount, because I'm reading it now and I don't remember saying this out loud. So NLSLA was one of the only ones in my batch that came back to say that at 1.1 million, they would actually take it mostly from their partners. So they, no one else was honest in that way, but they just said we would reduce our partner subgrants. This is about a 27% cut. They'd reduce their partner subgrants by 33% from about $75,000 to $50,000. And they would reduce their own case numbers slightly, like 15 full scope per quarter to like 12 per quarter, that kind of thing. But they proposed to mostly kind of cut back a little bit on the funded partnerships, but try to keep their numbers high.
Well, what's our surplus now, Chris?
So I changed this to green because we already took this out.
Okay.
So it's 100,000. If we lowered CRLA by 100, that's 200. And then we just proposed another 100. So that puts us at $300,000 to reallocate. If we lowered CRLA by 100. So I think Banashe, you're the one suggested looking at the ones that are getting a lot of funding. You know, the scoring team did take careful note of when they were getting a multi-million-dollar HB3 formula grant, and it's to do different work, right? They can't use it for the same work, but we did note that these larger ones, these larger programs like CRLA, Inland County's Legal Services, Public Counsel, I think. And one of the appendix, I don't remember which one it is. It might be appendix letter B. Actually, thank you, Danielle.
I'm sorry, attachment B has each program's formula allocation in it.
So you can see it. That I think was at the end of the day, this quarantine, when we were really trying to figure out where to cut. We ended up at the very end, like that's what we started looking at. We're like, okay, well, they're getting $2.5 million already. Maybe they can take another 100 from them and give it to, you know, the little program that's getting $150,000 formula grant.
Yeah. But I would like to look at this a little more.
Yeah, are there any of the bigger awards like Banashe was saying that jumps out to anybody that
like Inland County, you know, at 1.3, having requested 1.5.
And they're also getting 3.9 in the formula, inland counties.
Yeah. I think we could cut off another 100,000 there if everyone's in agreement.
I'm okay with that.
What about public counsel?
I think I'd probably be fine with the ICLS cut, but I do want to note it's because I mean they're rural, right? It's San Bernardino, Riverside, that area is hard to serve.
I know.
Sorry, was it Eric? Or Rich? Someone just.
I just asked about public counsel. They're getting a lot of money, and I know they're getting a lot of money from the other income streams.
Yeah, that one might be a good one to take a look.
I would feel comfortable on that one at 50. I'm not sure I'd go 100.
For public counsel, Rich?
Yeah.
That's interesting because of what I just heard. I was thinking 250 and give 50 back to Inland County.
Public counsel is one of the few that serves every county in the state.
Danielle, do you,
wait, does this project serve every county? Is this the one?
Do you remember, because this was in your batch?
Public, yeah, let me just unhide that.
This was the foreclosure one, right?
Public counsel is just LA County, foreclosure prevention and bankruptcy legal services through clinics.
For this project, they proposed just
right.
Yeah.
And
Danielle, like they're getting 1.2 of other. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's the recommended, sorry.
They're in the formula, they're getting 2.6 million.
2.6, yeah.
Oh, that they're getting, it's a sizable.
And under the formula, are they also serving only LA County?
That I'm not sure. I could get there. It'll just take me a minute.
So yeah, currently we're at $400,000 if these question marks became confirmed.
So if I'm recapping correctly for public counsel, Rich said he was comfortable with a 50,000 cut, but Bonachet, what was your counter? I didn't.
It was at 250.
It was 250, and the reason 250, I know it sounds like a massive amount given what we're talking about, but because of access to additional funding where some of the other organizations may not have. And I understand and appreciate that they really do serve, a swath of the area. But I want to, I guess where it's coming from is just equity with some of the other organizations that may not have access to the same types of funding streams.
I'd go up to 100, but I wouldn't feel real comfortable at 250, Bonachet.
150.
How about 1.25?
Holy kidding. All right, 1 quart.
Yeah, would 150, Rich, would you feel comfortable? Because I do hear Bonachet's point. I think I agree with it. If you can just look at their board of trusts, their board of directors, it's all the major law firms in LA, whereas inland counties just doesn't have access to that.
Okay, all right, you wore me down, 150.
So 1, 2,
But then let's not forget to put inland county at a 50,000 cut as opposed to 100,000 cut.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, $500,000 to reallocate right now.
And that's sizable.
That is
That's
plenty.
does anybody have a feeling on how much more we'd want to try to cut before we start allocating it?
Well, I think we should, in fairness, take a look at NLS just one more time.
Chris and Danielle, do you remember between public counsel and NLS, the quantitative numbers, which one?
Which one was like?
Had bigger numbers.
More of an impact.
Yeah.
Danielle, if you can look at public counsel, I'll pull up NLS.
Sounds good. And I did look at their public counsel's formula grant is also only in LA County, if that's helpful.
Just to be consistent, I'm gonna, because we're to keep everyone the same, I'm gonna put Inner City Law Center back at 1,400,000, and I'm just gonna make this a question mark, because before I had actually incorporated the cut into their number, but that was treating them differently. So it's still $500,000 to reallocate. I just corrected that. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm looking at NLS because they wrote back to say that they would, how they would revise their numbers with their new amount. So they would mostly reduce their subgrants. So their NLSLA at the proposed, they're down here, 1.1 million. 15 full scope representation in civil litigation cases per quarter. Would change to 12 per quarter. They would lower it to 12 per quarter. They would do 72 administrative hearings, brief services, inter-counsel and advice per quarter. Outreach, and then focus groups, outreach, and communication, education. Focus groups, outreach, and community education would stay the same. They only brought their numbers down a little bit.
And for public counsel, they unfortunately, or just differently, did their numbers in total over the full 3 years. They didn't break it out annually or quarter by quarter, so we'll have to do a little bit of math. But they proposed to provide 99 clinics, combining legal services and housing counseling, serve 1,650 clients in default or danger of default on their mortgage, reach 660 additional homeowners through at least 33 Know Your Rights presentations, organize 6 training events, and then provide limited representation or pro-per services to 530 homeowners over the life of the project. And those are incorporating their cuts that they made to their deliverables in response to our original budget recommendation.
It's a lot of numbers, but I'm not sure if a lot of them are duplicative or if there's overlap or what.
Right. I think some of the client numbers, those are clients being served in the clinic. So those are a bit duplicative in that respect. But then the training events feel like a separate set of work.
Why don't we take the 500 we have, unless anybody wants to further monkey with it and just try to reallocate it?
I'm for that.
Sounds good.
Then just looking down the increases, I don't know if you want to start at the top, Jim. Like CILS is the first one with an increase, question mark. CILS, the scoring team recommended 700,000. They asked for 971. If anybody, it'd be helpful if anyone had a, whoever originally thought like, oh, let's make that an increase question mark. If you happen to remember that you were that person.
Yeah, that was me.
Okay.
And that was me based on the discussion that the $271,000 reduction was based on the fact that this organization couldn't give real data in terms of community served and the number served. So what I was mentioning is that I believe an organization like this with the community that they're serving in the area that they're serving are going to have a harder time providing those types of numbers that we're looking for, and that shouldn't be then used against them. So that was the thought here.
And I think that was one factor of, I think another big factor for this organization is they have had challenges an organization-wide. So though they are a great organization, they're LSC funded, we thought an infusion of $1 million might be a bit much. But if you feel strongly, do you want to suggest an increased amount?
I'd like to increase it by an additional 70,000, at least to get them to 770.
Okay.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but can I just note that if we have 500 and we have 8 potential increases, I'm not saying we should do this, but just to keep this in your head, if we divided them equally, that would be what, 40 a piece? Did I do the math right? 8 times, is that right? No, that's wrong.
Oh, be more like 60.
That's wrong. Yeah.
It would be percentage-wise, Eric, for each one of them would be a variance, a substantial variance. If you did it that way. If you divided it up equally, some of them are going to be impacted substantially as a percentage, others margin. I like the idea of 70 for CILS.
Okay.
That leaves us with 430.
You know, I'm wondering whether going down makes sense, because that's what happened to EDC. They got their cut by the time you get to them.
Yeah.
You run out.
That's why I was trying to establish a somewhat of a placeholder, not that I would definitely divide it equally, just to kind of start with that as a presumption, then we can move it around, based on kind of the percentages that we think are fair.
These could be placeholders. Yeah.
Yeah, so this would put us at, if we did this, 430,000 remaining to allocate. And the next one is ILRC. They sought $475,353, and we recommended $300,000. So this was a more modest budget request from the support center.
I would support whatever my colleagues think is the highest amount here. I think in terms of what the other organizations that were asking for that modest amount, they're receiving less, substantially less.
They're deliverables were a bit mushy for this project. We not that we didn't think it was worthwhile. And if this is the project that Kim Savage had issues, I don't want to speak on her behalf.
Oh,
She's
during the
not here, but
calibration session.
during the
yeah.
calibration
Got
session.
it, got it.
So there are some issues with it.
Now I remember. Thank you. Yeah.
So I think the scoring team and Jim, Danielle, Chris really chime in, but we did feel fairly strongly about that 300,000. But whoever suggested that, if you feel strongly the other way, if you want to suggest another number, please do so.
That was my suggestion, and I can withdraw that suggestion unless Rich has a.
No, it's unfair because Kim's analysis of this is usually right on the money. And in this case, that's literal. But I would say that we should take them up maybe 30,000.
Okay.
I'm okay with that.
Okay. Why don't we try that out?
Okay, so that leaves us $400,000 to allocate. So Justice and Aging is also a support center. Requested 915,000, recommended 600,000. Danielle, do you I know you talked about it earlier, but do you mind giving us like the one sentence refresher on why we came in at 600 versus closer to 915?
Oh, sure, yes.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, you're fine. This was one of the projects we struggled a little bit with quantifying or clearly understanding the impact because the intervention is a convening of legal service providers to strengthen capacity statewide, which scored highly. We think it's a strong project, but because it's a couple steps removed from the actual provision of legal services and just because of their role as a support center, this was one that we struggled a little bit in how to balance not penalizing them for being a support center with the fact that it's slightly more removed from the direct provision of services.
How did they react to the suggestion about getting 600,000?
They said that they would convene 4 meetings per year instead of their original proposal, which was 6. They would hold 2 trainings annually instead of their original proposal that was 2 to 3 per year. And then they would create 1 to 2 written reports or educational kind of materials per year when their original proposal was 2.
Those are substantial reductions in services. 1 to 2 is only, or 1 from 2 is a 50% cut in deliverables.
The counter to that, if even if you fully funded them, their numbers aren't. I mean, it's not. To me, it doesn't seem like a large body of work for 900,000.
Yeah, it's not that impactful.
Yeah, and so that's why I think we gave them a cut on the first place, because for 900,000, it didn't seem like some of these other projects where they're serving thousands. And I mean, and this is why Danielle is saying we don't want to penalize them for the nature of support center services, because sometimes it is hard to quantify. But it's you know, it's hard not to compare when some of the other programs are pulling thousands.
What I would add to the conversation for JIA is they put $240,000 on their budget for subgrants. And Eric, this is one where you might be like, it's not very specific as to what the subgrantees will be doing. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4 subgrantees that would each be getting $20,000 per year. So it adds up to $240,000 over 3 years. And all they say they'll be doing is they're giving the subgrantees $60,000 over 3 years, quote, to support staff participation in collaborative steering committee meetings, trainings, and joint advocacy. So it's not particularly detailed. It's 4 pretty sizable subgrants, and that's $240,000 of their budget. So that kind of is like about the amount that was. It's just under the amount that was cut. If that makes any difference. So I'm sure the subgrantees would bear a fair amount of that shortfall if we came in at 600, and I don't know if that's good or bad.
Can we pass that one for a moment and deal with the others and maybe see if we have any money left over that we want to give to them?
That's a good
Absolutely.
suggestion, yeah.
The next one is Community Legal Aid SoCal. They asked for a little over $1.1 million and we came in at 900,000. We thought this was a really compelling project on focus on Orange County and South LA County, traditional legal aid. And we came in at 900 again, just because they have other funding streams, including sizable HP3 formula funding and federal funding. So we felt they thought they could weather it. But
And
I think
they said that they didn't, I can't remember right, Chris, there wasn't going to be really much of a modification.
not much. Yeah, it was very reasonable adjustment of like the targets. It wasn't concerning. And I think we left them as an increase ? Because the Orange County was only going to have one other focus service provider, and that was Public Law Center. But Public Law Center was going to focus on mobile homeowners, and Community Legal SoCal was going to be sort of the like landlord tenant renters focused project. And Orange County does have a large population. I can't remember how big they are, but a lot of people live there. So I think that's why it was an increase.
That seems like a really solid justification for an increase.
I'd go up to $1 million.
Yeah.
Orange County is at 3.176 million residents. So that would be plus 100,000.
Okay. So how much do we have left? 300,000, is that?
300,000, that's right. The next is Bay Area Legal Aid. It's the same thing for them. We just thought they could weather the shortfall because of their other funding, including HP3 formula. Otherwise, it's a strong landlord tenant focused project. Also, one of the only service providers for Contra Costa and Alameda, in the same way that Community Legal Aid SoCal was going to be one of the only ones for Orange County.
But their formula is pretty similar activities, right, Chris?
I think so. I can't remember exactly what their formula. We can look it up, but it was not going to overlap, but it's similar type work. Kind of home like renters, counsel and advice, limited scope, and full scope representation in landlord tenant rental disputes. I think it was probably a different geography.
I think neighborhood legal services were getting formula of $2 million.
So does someone feel strongly about the Bay Legal increasing it?
I don't feel too strongly about it, but I'd go up. I have no problem going up.
I do. I think we should go up.
You think we should go up? Okay. How much do you guys want to go up?
What do we have left?
300,000.
And we have 3 organizations to potentially increase, maybe
There's
4 potentially to increase.
And we skipped over justice and aging.
But actually, the 2 at the bottom are the ones that look like they really need.
Yeah.
EDC had a lot cut from it, and it's a small program that can't weather it as easily as some of the big ones.
70 EDC.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Bay Legal or EDC?
EDC.
What would you give them? Sorry, I missed that number, Eric.
70.
At least.
I'll put 70 as like a with a question mark, just so because we might want to come back to that.
Yeah, I'd go higher than that.
Yeah, I would say go higher than that, over $1 million, because look at how sharp the.
Yeah, it's the biggest cut.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I just try and be conservative. I agree with you.
I think put a placeholder of 100.
Yeah, I agree.
Or yeah.
Okay.
And let's look at Bay Area Legal.
Now we're at $200,000.
Okay.
Oh yeah, we didn't finish Bay Legal. I think
No, we
Rich
didn't.
said 100. Is that right? Or am I?
Yes.
And that leaves
And their
100.
formula is just under $1 million for Bay Area.
Under $1 million.
That sounds familiar, like 990,000 or something like that. Yeah.
So at this point, we've got 100,000 left.
And staff is going to check out. We'll take a 5-minute break, and staff will check the math again. But we should be at 100,000 left.
I think if we can just go back to justice in aging, I think there was a lot of good reasoning behind why the 600,000. I would vote to leave it as is and divide the additional 100,000 in some way for the last two.
NLSLA and Sloloff,
Yes.
50-50.
Are you all okay with EDC seems like the sharpest cut to me, but maybe my math is off. I just want to make sure you're comfortable with that.
I think
Well,
so, Duana, only because there's some others who had also asked for the 1.5 and have received $1 million or so.
Okay.
This puts them at $1 million.
Okay.
What did they
Okay.
receive on formula?
EDC, Daniel or Tammy probably has that, but my guess is they got 150. They probably got the minimum, but let's see what they really got.
Yeah, they only got 150, and so did San Luis Obispo only got 150.
That was
And
the
when you say
smallest could
150,
possibly
you
get.
mean 150,000.
150.
Yeah,
correct.
for all 3 years, so 50,000 per year.
Because NLS got 2 point something, right? Is that?
Yeah, NLS, LAFLA, and Public Council are kind of up in the high. They kind of got like 2 million-ish. I think Bay Legal got about $1 million for their formula grant, and then the smallest you could possibly get was $150,000.
So would you guys be comfortable with dividing out that remaining 100 between EDC and San Luis Obispo?
Yeah. I think I'd be more comfortable with that.
Like 75 for San Luis Obispo and another 25 for EDC?
That sounds fair.
Sounds good to me.
So it's 125 for EDC and 75 for San Luis Obispo. And we'll leave NLSLA at 1.1 million and Justice and Aging at 600,000. I think the scoring team, if I can speak for everyone else, probably supports this. There was areas where we really regretted cutting. I don't remember us really. I thought we felt pretty comfortable with 600 for Justice and Aging. And then NLSLA did come back and say that their numbers would only change a little bit. They would ask their partners to take less. And so they didn't seem that shocked at $1.1 million.
Should we do a 5-minute break so you can check the math?
Yeah, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna fix this table. So this is the table that you're gonna see after you come back the break is the one you're gonna vote on. So I'm gonna change it to the actual, it's gonna be the award amount. I'm gonna remove this column. I'm probably gonna remove the score and request columns because you'll just be voting on program number. And we'll check to make sure it adds up to 19,500,000.
Could you leave for the request on to vote just so we can see?
Yeah. If you think that's okay for the resolution, I can leave it in.
Yeah.
I can leave the scores in too.
Yeah, why don't you leave the score request and then just what they recommended, but you don't have to take off the changed one once you figure out if the numbers.
And I'm going to format it so that the resolution, it's only one sentence, is fits on the slide with it. So I'll take me a couple minutes to do all that. Jim, is it okay if we come back at, can we just make it 3:50? This is our last thing. There's nothing else to do after this vote. So,
Yeah, as long as you think we can end by 4.
yeah. Does that work for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
While we're off, while you guys are checking the math, can I just raise sort of a process point just for schmoozing a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
So you guys can go check the math while we're doing this. But so a lot of these programs are talking about creating educational materials.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I wonder about just for the future is, are we sort of in some way checking to see if people are sharing these materials or if they aren't reinventing the wheel? I mean, a lot of people are creating, how many different know your rights things can you possibly do, right? The law is the law. Well, I guess they have some different processes, but I just wonder about that,
That's a good question, Eric. It's a pain point. I don't know if you recall when the first tranche of money was distributed, we did have a convening, and then programs shared what their resource, and they all even acknowledged, right, Bonnie, that there should be a better coordination so that the wheel is not being invented over and over again. But that's to say, no, we don't have a great mechanism. I think maybe the best that we can do in terms of TA is to maybe have another one of those statewide regional meeting and help programs kind of coordinate more. Bonnie, I don't know if you have thoughts, but that is, you've hit the nail on. Yes, we know that this is an issue.
Yeah, I'll say in our self-help contracts, sometimes we actually require people to share and then we post it on a coordinated website, and there are issues, of course, with some things being public. So, if there's a housing website or housing website that the legal aid advocates use or something like that, that might be another thing to consider.
I mean, because
you're right.
We made the offer of like trying to be the repository, and that was not. And I agree with them. That's not a good idea because they're already on so many listservs and so many. It's gonna dilute it. It's just it doesn't seem like some of their line staff are getting directed to there's two right now, two hubs. Western Center is one of them, and I can't recall the other one. Bonnie probably knows, but there's like two main listservs where things should live, but there's not great coordination, especially down from line staff. Sometimes the ED will know or the housing director will know, but it just the information is not flowing down the way it should.
But we may want to talk about if there's a way. I mean, there was a brief bank that was established at one point, and again, that had to be password protected for any number of reasons. But some of the educational materials, yeah, I think a convening and I don't know, she gives some thought to it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that they are like turning to Western Center now because they've just been kind of the on the grounds interpreting all the different laws. So that seems like that's been the hub now. Formally and informally. But with that said, it does seem like some of these projects are still cropping up with know your rights presentation, where maybe that should just be a couple support centers or with the help of one or two POSPs to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I had the same comment about, and this is where I was coming from a little bit on the ICLC computer program. I just feel like like yesterday I was talking to Beit Sedek about a gender marker change for a client, and they did a fee waiver. And one of the forms that ICLC was going to create was an automatic, fee waiver form. And I gotta believe that exists. And I can't believe we don't.
Yeah, we have these in a program called Hot Docs that's available to anybody in the community. And we've done I think the question is, how. I don't know. I mean, you may have been following the changes in the law, and I'll be really interested if somebody's come up with a way to make it easy for people to go through, particularly all the COVID defenses. But we can, we're always obviously happy to share because, we actually do a lot of the programs for Beit Sedek. We'll do a lot for LA because LA has, so they'll actually use all kinds of, computer generated things because they have so much volume. So, but yeah, happy, but I do think we can obviously reach out to ICLC.
Almost ready.
And Bonnie and I had been brainstorming, like, because we do have admin money to be able to support programs. So maybe sometime next year, we could do another gathering or something, but be a bit more like an update on the law. Then maybe we get an update on where they are in their progress, sharing out, creating a document and sharing out what they've created. And then maybe, I don't know, we could be a bit more proactive in the planning for that. Programs did say they wanted us to be a convener somehow in terms of getting them together. They want to talk with one another and share thoughts instead of just having like panelists. So being more interactive. Sorry, Bonnie, I cut you off.
No, I was just thinking, I mean, we could also sort of segment it a little bit and do like a know your rights kind of couple 3 hours, where people share information and get into small work groups or things like that on Zoom or, some of these other things. Because I mean, they're also trying to target different populations. So they may need to have information, that's a little bit more focused, but you can always learn from what other people have done, even if you don't say that's exactly what I want. So a lot of times it's like, oh, but that was that was a great way to explain this concept.
I'd like to bring up a couple of other issues that the scoring group came up with. Just want to present it to the committee. we were thinking to adopt the changes for the next request for proposal when it comes along to change the wording on evaluation to follow the proposal that Eric had for the partnership grants. That we clearly felt that the evaluation wording needs to be a little bit more specific in scope. And we also wanted to require more details on how partnership money is being spent, as you brought out, Eric, and to actually specify that in the grant proposal, that they talk about that more specifically. And then finally, we felt that the definition of underserved groups should be more clearly addressed by the proposals, because they typically use the BIPOC, the Black, Indigenous, People of Color language, and that's not particularly enlightening, as opposed to really getting into outreach to vets or what they're going to do with indigent people in terms of outreach or whatever. So that instead of just mentioning the same boilerplate over and over again, that we would like a little bit more specificity in the grant proposals. So I just wanted to bring that up with the rest of the committee. And the other thing too is that this approach was created because of the compressed timeline that we had in order to get these grants funded, because the legislators wanted them funded early, and also on the whole issue of addressing partnerships that were not state bar funded. But it is different because it's only one group that goes through all the proposal in detail, as opposed to splitting up into groups. And I think all of us will have had experience doing it both ways, and whether or not we ought to talk about what is the ideal way in the future for these discretionary grants to be handled. I mean, should it be divided amongst the committee members as we've done in the past? Or should it be a more focused group doing the detailed work and then discussing like we did today in terms of the results? And I think there are pros and cons for both approaches, but I don't think one is superior over the other necessarily. I mean, the way we've done it for this is that you have less scoring inconsistency because one group is scoring all of them. But on the other hand, on the final decision, there's less full committee involvement in all the details. So I don't know which is the better approach, but I think we ought to think about it for the future, which way we ought to go. Oh, it looks like we got the numbers now. Chris is back.
All right, they are ready.
Christian has his hand raised.
Actually, Christian has a comment.
Yeah, Christian, go for it.
Yeah, just to respond, it's definitely less engaging, Jim, to have not read them and to not have the sort of sharp background other than having gone through them. So I mean, I guess like when I say read them, I mean read them for the purposes of scoring. But like, I will say that, you know, my observation here is that at the end, we've just evolved back into this round number game, which seems to be sort of antithetical to the whole process. So I do think like I would be in favor of a more fully engaged process by the full committee, even though it's a lot more work.
Do you mean by does that mean like every committee member reading every single application?
Or at least reading, you know, a larger percentage of them, yeah. I mean, even if we're not engaged in the scoring process, if there's some sort of obligation to report out in some manner, again, I have sort of two other thoughts. One is that you know, it's a lot of work for the competitive grants, and there's formula funding that for many of these organizations is already very significant. It seems to me like the competitive grant process really could open the door to partnerships in a way that the formula funding doesn't. And you know, when organizations aren't partnering, I don't know, it feels less satisfying to me. Maybe that's just a, you know, qualitative take. So if I'm balancing like on the various scales, on the one hand, there's a lot of work. On the other hand, you know, you could drive innovation. You could open the doors to non-IELTS funded organizations that are not going to be part of the formula funding. But if we're not actually doing that, it strikes me that the competitive grant process is a ton of work. And I don't know.
You know, I think that this whole area merits more of a discussion than the 5 minutes we have left for this.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm not
with
suggesting
Eric.
we reach a conclusion. I just wanted people to think about it. At some point, I think the commission as a whole ought to address the issue in greater detail.
I agree. And I agree with so much of what Christian just was speaking to. I think if we can have another meeting, Jim, devoted to this discussion, because, you know, from HP2 to HP3, we tried to make some changes to help streamline the process. But I think this is all part of our learning as well on what is the best, where are we going to land that's going to provide the optimum level of what we're looking for in the process. So I think, you know, what you're bringing up and what Christian was speaking to really does deserve being discussed more in length.
And I think it should be discussed by this committee, not so much by the whole commission. I mean, it could be discussed by the whole commission, but I think it should first be discussed by this committee because we'll have more of an opportunity to really go back and forth. And we have 25 people on the phone.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, can I make
agree,
a suggestion, Jim? Because
we need to finish up, but I agree.
Yeah.
But I think we ought to do it after the partnership grant finishes its exercise because they're following the same procedure and we'll have two perspectives.
So the I know at least one person has to leave right at 4. So the Daniel and I have independently corroborated these numbers. So you're voting on the names in the applicant column as grantees, and the award amount will be the numbers in the recommended column all the way to the right. And the resolution reads, normally we wouldn't do it in a table format because we made so many changes this seems to be the easiest. So it reads, resolved that the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission Homelessness Prevention Funds Committee recommends the following 2022-2024 homelessness prevention competitive grant recipients and amounts.
So moved.
So Eric, thank you, Eric. Second.
Second.
Was that Rich?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll take the vote. Meeker.
Yes.
Aflagi.
Yes.
And then I think Al-Saraf is still away. Iskin.
Yes.
Mahoney.
Yes.
Thank you. Rhinus.
Yes.
I think Savage is still absent, which is joined. Okay. And Schreiber.
Yes.
Motion carries, Jim.
Great.
Well done, everybody. So the commission has to vote on the final awards, but this is the committee's recommendation to the commission for its meeting on December 13th.
Just really quick, I know we're at probably the hour, Jim, and you want to close up. I want to thank all of you for all of the work that you did do. This is not a small task, given the numbers of applicants, and so exciting to see that there's going to be some amazing work out there with the funds that are available. So thank you guys for providing this process and doing it as smoothly as you did for all of us. And really just quickly in the last minute, Duan had a suggestion based on what the discussion was. If you could just speak your suggestion really quickly and then we can.
I was just going to say, you wanted to have another debrief on the earlier side, but Jim's suggestion of waiting until after partnership grant, that works too. I just thought if you wanted to have, we can call another meeting in like January or February, but we can also wait.
Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you, guys. I'll turn it back over to you, Jim. Sorry to hijack your meeting.
Well, that's okay. I got to run off to a doctor's appointment. Thanks for everybody's hard work and reaching a conclusion. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Danielle.
Well done, everyone. Thank you.
Hey, have a good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Oh, it's